Hello and welcome for the next time and the last time to the Demi Taste podcast. We're not going anywhere. We're just changing the name. I'm your host, currently known as Demi Taste, but always known as Doug. My co-host Phil is joining us as always, and our special guest today is Mark Vierthaler of Whiskey Del Bach, and we're going to talk all about Mesquite-smoked whiskey today. So, Mark, actually, I keep promising that I'm going to do a little bit of self-promo before we get into the interview. So let's put a pin in that real quick. And let me show you this awesome thing. So Phil is a bit of a craftsman and made these hand-carved pens from barrel stave blanks that he's been sourcing. So this is it's a wonderful, not a fountain pen, I guess, but a rollerball. But those were options. And this is made from a wild turkey blank, which comes with a stave. It's made from a wild turkey blank, which is made from a stave, comes with a certificate of authenticity, and kind of smells like whiskey, if you believe.
Yeah.
So this is a really cool thing, and that's sort of a nice dovetail to like what we're trying to do here. So we are renaming the podcast very soon to something that makes sense in an elevator pitch, because Demi Taste podcast requires you to know things about me and about espresso. And when you're introducing yourself to strangers, it ends up being really awkward explaining what the hell this podcast is. So Single Malt Frontier is the name we're planning to use for the podcast going forward. And the focus is going to be the same kind of content that you've been watching this whole time. Once we settled into this interview format with experts from the field, this is what the podcast is going to be, more or less. And we wanted to have a name that would encapsulate that and make it easier for people to find us. So that's what we're planning to do. And as part of that, we're hoping soon enough to launch a merch website, and possibly a website where you can get access to our barrel picks, which are in progress and hopefully will be a growing thing depending on how well they go. So we've got a new website under construction. We're going to have all those things up eventually, and just stay tuned. So if Phil has the capacity and there's enough interest, he may make more of these pens on demand for people. I'm sure at the very least that he will entertain requests. So one of the best ways to get in touch with Phil right now to get these pens is to join us in the Whiskey Lodge, link in the description as always, and let Phil know that you're interested. They really are very nicely made. And if you're a pen enthusiast and you want a pen made out of barrel wood, this is one way to do it. So now that we've done that little bit of self-promo, and hopefully next week when we have a new name, people aren't too terribly surprised, let's move on to what we're here for. So for the last time, welcome to the Demi Taste podcast, where we do a little bit of tasting and a lot of talking. Usually we talk about whiskey, but the best thing about whiskey are the conversations we get to have, and we get to talking about a little bit of everything. Our special guest today is Mark Vierthaler of Whiskey Del Bach, head distiller. I believe I have the title correct?
Correct.
And we're going to learn all about Mesquite-smoked whiskey. So with no further ado, Mark, tell us about yourself, what you do, and a little bit of the story of Whiskey Del Bach.
Yeah. First off, thank you guys so much for having me on. I know it's been kind of tough for us to finagle and get the time, so I'm really happy we were able to make it work. So, my name's Mark. I'm the head distiller at Whiskey Del Bach. Whiskey Del Bach, for those of you who aren't familiar, we are in Tucson, Arizona. And we are mostly known for, as you had said, what we call our mesquited, not peated American single malt. So this year is actually our 13th anniversary. So 13 years of making American single malt in the Sonoran Desert. And we were born out of this idea. We were co-founded, Stephen Paul and his daughter Amanda are the ones who started this back in 2011. And Stephen, our co-founder, he and his wife, Elaine, had a furniture design business here in Tucson called Arroyo Design. And they, in particular, specialized in mesquite furniture. Stephen was always kind of attracted to these harder woods. Typically, some of the most beautiful ones tend to be rainforest wood. That's really problematic. Making furniture with rainforest wood, not exactly ideal. So Stephen was born in California, but raised here in the Sonoran Desert, and the mesquite tree is indigenous to this region. And if you've never seen a mesquite tree, it's very striking. It's this kind of gnarled, twisted, looks immediately like a bush and then grows into this tree. And it is a beautiful hard wood. It is also notoriously difficult to work with. And so that is what they decided they were going to focus on, was creating these very beautiful pieces of furniture from mesquite wood. And both Stephen and Elaine are big single malts, in particular Scotch. In particular, they really like Macallan 12. Like that's their go-to Scotch. And what they would do is they would take their scraps at the end of the day, and they would utilize these mesquite scraps to cook with or to burn in the fire pit. And one night they're sitting in their backyard in downtown Tucson, and Elaine has this idea. She says, people use peat to dry malts in Scotland. Has anyone ever considered using mesquite to do it? And if you've ever met Stephen, Stephen's the type of guy that gets very interested. He kind of gets his hooks into things. And so he was just really intrigued with this idea of, could you make a mesquite-smoked single malt? And so he taught himself how to floor malt, taught himself how to distill, and really set about trying to create something that was very uniquely of the Sonoran Desert. He started playing around with this idea in the back of the wood shop for a couple of years, started distilling, got to a point where he felt like he was really producing some good new make, and there was starting to be a buzz, pun kind of intended, and just people being really interested in what he was doing. And so his daughter Amanda, who had been in New York, had recently moved back to Tucson and was like, okay, this is a great idea. Let's make it official. And so 2011 is when Whiskey Del Bach officially became a distillery and products started coming out onto the market. And it's kind of interesting to note because, and I think it'll actually be the first thing that we taste tonight, is the classic is a 100% unsmoked, but that was the very first product. If you're not familiar, smoke can be divisive. And one of the things that Stephen really wanted to make sure that he had achieved before he set about creating this mesquited single malt was he wanted to create a single malt that was of the same quality as the Macallan 12. He's always, we're always quick to say not similar in flavor profile, but similar in quality. And so once he kind of tackled the classic, then we eventually moved on to what will be our secondary tasting, which is the Dorado. But this is kind of the perfect introduction to Whiskey Del Bach, because while it doesn't utilize that mesquite smoked malt, we are really leaning in to some of those challenges and some of those opportunities that are presented by making whiskey in the desert Southwest. Because typically when you think of whiskey production, you're thinking Kentucky, Scotland, Ireland, tend to be a little more humid, tend to be a little more temperate. Really try to lean into that and create something that is unique and creates a sense of place when you make whiskey in the desert.
Yeah. All right. I guess I've already got my classic in the glass. My first reaction to this, based on what you just said, is that power of suggestion. I was probably convincing myself that I could taste smoke in this.
So this is kind of a cool conversation then. We've been told, or so I've been told by our VP of marketing, smoke by osmosis isn't a sexy story, but there will be a little bit of smoke by osmosis. So we're a small production facility, and our quote unquote rick house, our barrel storage, is right amongst the rest of our production. Our malt house is at the back of production. And when we do our smoke days, when we're smoking our malt on site, all of that smoke kind of blows in. And so you will get just that slightest hint of mesquite smoke on it. But we're also, kind of breaking with that Scottish tradition of we're going into brand new virgin oak. We're doing a medium plus toast, number 3 char. So you're also going to be able to take advantage of some of those smoky kind of guaiacol notes that you get in a brand new barrel.
All right. For the audience, in case anyone doesn't know, tell us about guaiacol real quick.
So the super simple is when we talk about smoke, there are a handful, 4 to 5 chemical bonds that create smoke flavor. Polyphenol and guaiacol are the 2 big ones. Guayacol tends to lead to that smokier kind of, some people interpret as an ashtray type note. But sometimes when you taste whiskey and you're like, oh, I get smoke on this, there is guaiacol produced during that charring process of the barrels. So you can always get a little bit of that, even if it isn't really coming through, say, from like a smoked substrate, like a smoked malt or a smoked corn.
I remember, I think I learned about guaiacol when I read a paper where some enterprising university students decided to figure out exactly how much water was great for your whiskey and wrote a paper.
I love it.
It's actually a really
Well,
well-written paper for the topic, but naturally, people who have sensory reviewing experience are like, I don't know if you've quite gotten all the nuance, but like it's cool. It's cool that for your one particular setup, you came up with a scientific answer.
right.
Yeah, tasting notes wise on this one, it's so first I'll say I actually brought one of these bottles to my string quartet rehearsal last night,
Oh my God.
and the first comment I got actually was that it reminded them of Scotch, and then they went on talking about Macallan and so on. So
Oh my
like that
God.
definitely is like, for people who are more casual in whiskey, that definitely is like the association that's there, right? That
Mhm.
and I guess on the cleaner, less smoky side, right, you end up with that idea of Macallan. And I haven't tried putting this next to a Macallan yet. I suppose I could. In the back of my head, I feel like they're not all that similar to my own sort of sensory analysis.
Right. Right. And I don't think so either. But that's why we always try to make that differentiation of not so much the, not so much the sensory similarity, but just this is an excellent, solid whiskey. Like it's something you can go to. It can be a daily drinker. Because we kind of again break with tradition in a lot of ways. With Scotch, obviously, you have to go into used cooperage. You're going in around 120. You're getting a little less interaction with that oak. We've actually had a lot of people who tend to be like very big bourbon drinkers or very big rye drinkers that maybe have been a little bit cool on the American single malt, but then they taste something like us. They taste something like Balcones, where you have those bigger, more aggressive oak influences. And so for us, obviously, you're going to get a lot more of that oak. You're going to get a lot more of those vanillins. You're going to be much more akin to kind of a classic American whiskey than what a lot of people think of when they're thinking of single malt.
Yeah, definitely. I guess there's only a few examples of mesquite smoked single malts that I've tried so far. Of course, Del Bach. And at this point, most of my experience by far is with Del Bach. And then Santa Fe, I have one sample of batch one, which I'm
Oh,
told is
wow.
quite different from the modern stuff. So I can't say that's what it tastes like, right? I can't have that in my, like, I have to keep going. Like, I know what I think that tastes like, but I need to set that aside because one day I'm going to get to try Santa Fe again, and I need to not have this preconceived notion. And I also get Santa Fe and Del Bach in blends of various origins, I guess. Probably
Mhm.
barrel, I think, doesn't include any mesquited whiskey, but not entirely sure. I should have looked that up. But there's the Good Deeds whiskey, which I apparently can't not mention at this point. This is what, the fourth interview in a row. So the
Yes,
Good
but
Deeds
it's
blend is
important.
awesome. Yeah.
The Good Deeds blended malt is very good and very important.
Naturally, the Flame blend from Lost Lantern, as
Yes.
well as, if I'm not mistaken, you're also in Vatted Malt #1.
We are actually not in Vatted Malt #1. Santa Fe is.
Okay.
So we were among the first single barrel releases that Adam and Nora at Lost Lantern did. I know we did at least two in the initial 2020 release, and those were our Mesquite-smoked as well. But we've kind of focused on that single barrel with them, and then what's been really cool is they've kind of utilized us in their most recent releases. So we had the Desert Dessert, which was two of our dessert finished smoked. The Mega Mesquite, which was a blend of a couple of our just really punchier, kind of more aggressive smoked barrels. And then, then the flame, which is blended with Santa Fe spirits, with the Colkegan, which is super cool because we are completely different. Like I always tell people, like, we are one of the few mesquite-smoked single malts, but if you taste us next to Santa Fe spirits, they're two completely different products. Colin is really kind of creating that traditional Scotch production style while utilizing mesquite for that stand-in. And again, we're trying to lean into that like new American, let's take advantage of super dry aging. We've got 30 to 40 degree fluctuations in a single day. Like one thing if you ever come on a tour, we'll talk a lot about diurnal shift. We really don't do any sort of environmental adjustment. Like we're not using HVAC, we're not using heating, we're not using any sort of humidity control. It is, I will leave, like in the winter, I can leave for work and it's 32 degrees and there's ice on my truck, and I get home and it's 75. And so when you have that, you just have this really aggressive interaction with the oak. And so you are getting much more coming out in such a short amount of time. And we actually have to be really careful about that because it can over extract really quickly. I always tell people, like, we kind of have to have it down to the gnat's ass. Like we have to be able to know, yes, this is perfect. Let's get it off of oak. Let's blend it. Either it goes into storage, goes into finishing, or it goes into a bottle. Because if you let it sit too long, and that can be as simple as sitting too long for a week, it's bitey, it's sharp, it's spiky, you have way too much tannin coming in. And we want to strike that balance of getting those nice wood sugars while still getting that punchiness from that fresh char.
Since you brought up diurnal shifts, I'm gonna show you this video that I was told that I should tell you I found randomly, and there's absolutely no reason I'm showing you this. Is it gonna go? Okay. I don't know if you can see that. It's a very small. I don't know how they managed to get a video with this few pixels in it. I think it's like 50 pixels tall. But what this is supposed to be is a map of diurnal shifts.
Mm-hmm.
What I wasn't totally clear on, lacking the context of this video, is whether that's supposed to be in a single day or seasonally.
Right. I mean, yeah,
I was told that I should ask you to comment on this. Maybe this is something you recognize.
So it's super interesting. So, man, this would have been a couple of years ago, probably 2 or 3 years ago, at the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission meeting during ACSA. I'm pretty sure it was actually Ryan from Boulder, from Vapor, who shared. If it wasn't him, it was Joe Sullivan. So Joe or Ryan, I apologize. Whoever of you shared this, but it was basically this side-by-side comparison of, okay, let's look at the climate zones within Scotland. And you're going to see maybe 5 to 6 degrees. Yeah, you're going to get a little bit of change when you hit those coasts, but overall, you're not seeing a whole lot of shift, especially from season to season. But then they put up, that literal heat map of America. And kind of like what that video just showed, you have all these aggressively different pockets. And you have hot and humid, you have hot and dry, cold and humid, cold and dry. And every single one of those things does something unique to that whiskey. And one of the things that I think is amazing about American single malt whiskey, and I think is cool that pretty much everyone I know is doing it, is leaning into that sense of place. People talk about the Texas style of whiskey. They talk about the Pacific Northwest style of whiskey, that leaning into that Providence, leaning into the ingredients you can get there, and then taking advantage of those weather patterns as well. And so, yeah, you can taste the difference between a Campbelltown and an Islay and a Highland, but you can really taste the difference between something coming out of, say, like Westland and something coming out of Balcones or us. You just have these completely different interactions. And for it just being 4 ingredients, malted barley, water, yeast, barrel, there are infinite combinations that can be done and can be created. And to me, it's cool to see that desire and that focus on creating that sense of place. I know terroir is kind of a dirty word within the whiskey community, not as much as it used to be, because you're not going to be able to taste the provenance of the barley that we used. Distilling kind of commodifies everything. But when you're taking advantage of those challenges and those opportunities, that does kind of create, to me, what you could call terroir. That is going to be something that, this is a distinctive style of spirit coming from a very distinctive area where it's produced.
Yeah, Phil, do you remember the word that we came up with as a better alternative for terroir last time? I believe it was with Reed.
I don't. I remember having the conversation, and we were talking about a sense of place and locality, but I don't remember what the specific word was. I should have written it down.
It is, yeah. It was. There's a lot of good words. For as far as we're concerned, terroir is not a bad word, right? It's not a dirty word,
right?
Like the word smooth, we recognize that it's somewhat problematic. Not necessarily to the same degree, right? But
like dry,
importantly, or like dry, right? Like, what does dry mean? I had this conversation. Is dry about sweetness in wine, or is dry about that feeling that leaves in your mouth, right? Afterwards, which is drying, astringent, right? So, like, all these words taken in the proper context. The important thing about the word terroir is it gets us talking we're in the right area. We know that we're talking about the things about the place that things came from or that aged in. That's helping us understand something about the whiskey. And I would love if we as a whiskey expert community could get past feeling awkward about the word terroir so that we could focus on the conversation we're trying to
have. But man, then how else can we feel superior? If we can't have things that we can be like, no, that is incorrect. We reject this terminology.
So it's interesting that you say that from our perspective, because interestingly, the people that I have most encountered who have a problem with using the word terroir to describe whiskey are actually people coming at whiskey from a wine direction, who see them as so fundamentally different and disconnected that the idea that these terms can be applicable to both, to them feels like whiskey taking from wine and corrupting a term from wine. And I find that to be its own sort of interesting sort of insular community position. But it's sort of one of those things where words have different meanings depending on context, and terroir in whiskey doesn't necessarily mean a sense of place in that you can taste the farm where the barley was grown, although Waterford is working on proving that that's the case. It really means a sense of where the whiskey was produced. So you produce whiskey that is distinctly yours, and another distillery who is, perhaps, all malt, clean water, good yeast, even the same yeast as you, barrels from the same source, will have a totally different product if they're doing it in, say, the foothills of Virginia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons, we try to be incredibly transparent. People come in and I will tell you where our barley comes from, what yeast strain we use, our fermentation temperatures, distillation cuts, how we age, where we age, why we age. Because, you can take everything that I have and you move it. I mean, you even move it an hour and a half north, up into Phoenix. And it's going to be completely different because, there's a 10 to 20 degree difference between Tucson and Phoenix because we're a little higher elevation. That there is no reason, like there's no grand secret of what we're doing. It's just taking advantage of what we have. And I always try to describe what we're doing as a love letter. We love the Sonoran Desert. It was one of the reasons Stephen and Amanda created Whiskey Del Bach, was this idea of a sense of, and I always feel like I come back to that, but that sense of place, that sense of, and whenever we're ready to get into the Dorado, we can kind of talk about that, but why Mesquite is so important and why Mesquite became so important to the Whiskey Del Bach brand, because it is so ubiquitous where we are. And to even be able to create something like that with the Classic, which is, unsmoked, and we're bringing that unsmoked malt in from other malt houses, it's still creating something that is distinctly Sonoran, distinctly Baja, Arizona.
Yeah, so it's almost impossible to like go very far in a conversation about Del Bach and not talk about Mesquite. But I think that while we're on the Classic, we should actually dig in a little bit to the fact that this is our baseline. This is what the Sonoran Desert does with what Del Bach does on the stills, in the barrels. There's so many elements that apply, but to the extent that the desert is a terroir, right? We're experiencing the result of that in this whiskey in a way. I like being able to taste something that is unique.
Mm-hmm.
Even better, I like being able to taste something that's unique that I like. Right?
Right.
Because we can, not to name names, right? But there's some unique stuff that, I'm not going to reach for twice.
But, to that point, though, but they take that stand, right? Like, to me, that's the cool thing is, even if I don't like it, you went for it. Like, before I was ever a distiller, when I was just a whiskey and spirits writer, I'm not going to name names. I remember exactly what it was, a Speyside Scotch. And my one tasting note was it doesn't have the good taste to be bad. It was so middle of the road. It was like, at least do something. Like, even if it's terrible, you swung for the fences. And it was just so middle of the road, so unremarkable. It was fine. and it's always stuck with me because I've had some things that are just really unique and I've loved, and I've had some things that are unique that I've hated. But to have the courage to do that, and to sometimes just put out okay, here's this absolutely forgettable whiskey that you've given me no reason to ever pick up a bottle ever again.
Yep. I wonder. So, fun fact: that bottle of Del Bach Classic that I'm trying to put my finger on behind me. Let me zoom in real quick. There's a button. Yeah, this one over here is a bottle I took home from the ACSA Grand Tasting. I've told this story before, but there's no better place to tell it than with the person who distilled the liquid. So Bartolome, who's here in the comments, and I were getting ready at the end of the night. We knew that when the lights came up, there would be a mad scramble for the bottles, right? So we're hanging around the table that has all the American single malts, and I've amassed a little dragon's hoard of 3 or 4 bottles that I'd really like to take home. And someone walks up next to me and says something, and then the lights come up, and I'm looking away, and Bartolome reached out underneath me and took the bottle of Dorado that I was going to go home with.
That is one of the highest compliments I can be given.
So she got the Dorado, and I got the Classic, which was also one of the bottles that I had planned on taking home, but I wanted to. I was being greedy. Let's be honest. But now I have all of them, so that's a fun closure to that sort of conversation. In the context of that tasting, so why I bring up the tasting, there were a lot of interesting American single malts. A lot of them not smoked. Some of them had some smoke to them. I'm a peat head. I gravitate towards the smoke. So on that table at the end of the night, when I'm comparing things and going oh, I like Dorado better than Classic. Now I know why. I think it's just that extra smoke that really does something for me. It also tasted sweeter somehow. We can, as we transition into the Dorado, we can talk about why that is. But the Classic really grew on me, and it especially, if this is your opener, it's not too sweet, it's not too dry, it's got some complexity, but it's not in your face in any way. The main tasting note I get that I feel is almost a distillery character is this sort of warm caramel, dulce de leche kind of flavor that I get in, I think, no other whiskey, at least no other whiskey that doesn't also have a weird chemical flavor on top of that somehow, or like too much wood, right? That wood lacquer kind of taste, right?
Right. It sat too long in the barrel, and oh no, we need to get it out.
Yep. So shall we move on, I guess, to the Dorado?
Sure. So make sure yeah, there we go. Okay, so the Dorado, this is what we call our flagship. This is what we're known for. So I've kind of touched on, the joke I always make, and it never gets a laugh, so I don't know why I keep making it. I keep making it because I like it. I say I'm contractually obligated to say, as Stephen brought those wood chips home, he would tell Elaine, there go our profits, up in smoke. I rarely get a laugh. I love that joke though. So, but yeah, it was born out of this idea of sense of place, creating something that, while inspired, we always like to say we're riffing on the Scottish model, or we're inspired by the Scottish model. If you've ever been in Arizona, New Mexico, Arizona in particular, though, and you're walking through a winter night, you're going to smell mesquite. Like mesquite is everywhere. In some places, it's even considered invasive. So you're using it to cook with, you're using it to provide heat, you're using it as, your bonfire wood. And it is this very distinctive flavor. I think one thing that I always struggle to tell people, like people ask, okay, you have a mesquite-smoked whiskey. What does mesquite taste like? Mesquite tastes like mesquite. It is such a distinctive note, and you hit the nail right on the head with that sweetness. And I should have I don't have it up in front of me. We did have our Dorado analyzed, and we looked specifically at the polyphenol content, guaiacol, 4-vinyl guaiacol. And I can't remember what the fourth one that is typically done when you're checking like your smoke levels in a whiskey. And we then compared it with a Laphroaig, I just want to say like a standard like Laphroaig 12. And depending on like how in the weeds you want to get, but you can actually see where those chemical breakdowns happen. And mesquite actually has a higher concentration of polyphenol versus guaiacol. The guaiacol tends to come through a lot more in the peat, at least in these examples that we had analyzed. And the guaiacol lends some of this kind of sweet, honeyed note to it. And a lot of people, when they do tend to think of smoke, they think of peat. So they think of that iodine, they think of that kind of Band-Aid note. I love, which that is one thing, like I'm right there with you. Like I love a big, peaty, aggressive Scotch. And mesquite has the opposite effect. It creates this kind of very warm, very sweet. I always say we're turning smoke into honey. It just creates this lovely enveloping note. And, I was just watching a video today, actually, of some people who were reviewing Dorado, and they were like, a lot of people say, well, you think of mesquite and you think of barbecue. And they're like, I get some barbecue, but it's still completely different. This isn't like smelling a piece of smoked meat. It is something wholly of its own. And to me, it's so evocative. It's my go-to. So I always tell people, they're like, oh, what do you drink at home? I said, I actually drink Dorado at home. It's what we use in our Manhattans. We use it in our Japanese highballs. We serve it neat. We serve it on the rocks because it's so distinctive. But at least we think it's also really balanced. It creates this little bit of smoke, this kind of little bit. I used to smoke a pipe. I don't anymore, but I used to smoke Cavendish tobacco. And if you've ever smoked Cavendish, it's kind of similar. It's this very sweet, kind of earthy note. And I get a lot of that in our Dorado. And with that, I'm going to take a quick sip of it because I've just been nosing it. So this is also another thing that kind of differentiates us. So we kind of touched on it at the beginning. So when we first started, when Whiskey Del Bach first began, Stephen and the first head distiller, Nathan, malted everything. Whiskey Del Bach was a 100% in-house malted, distilled, milled, mashed, fermented, everything done on site. We moved into our current space, I want to say it was either 8 or 9 years ago, and expanded to this custom malt house that we have in the back. We started floor malting. If you're familiar at all with floor malting, it takes up a lot of space. And when you are a craft distillery, you have to maximize all of the space that you have. And so Stephen worked with this engineering firm out of Oregon to create, it is a one-of-a-kind malt house. We've got our steep tank, and we basically have a modified mash tun that functions as our malting floor. It's a big mash tun. We can fit 5,000 pounds of raw barley seed in it after it's been steeped. And it has some screw augers and a rake arm. And that's kind of how we stop that velveting. We stop all of that from growing together. But it also lets us have a lot more control. We also realized pretty quickly as we grew, we didn't have the capacity to keep doing 100% of our own malting. So our unsmoked malt, we actually get from 2 different sources. We get what we call a non-GN or low GN Odyssey malt from Great Western Malting. And then we also work with Tex Malt out of the Fort Worth area because we also want to be able to support small craft malt houses. And especially, again, focusing on that, they're close by, we're creating something that is a product of its place. But for the smoked malt, what we call our MS or Mesquite-smoked that goes into our Dorado, goes into our Ode to Isla, goes into some of our other smoked releases. That is 2-row barley that we get from Front Range, Colorado, comes to us, and we do still malt that in-house and smoke it in-house. It's very hard to describe the system. We've got some pictures up online. I describe it as very Rube Goldberg-esque. It is, you have a whole bunch of pipes going in and out. But yeah, it's still functioning on that basic functionality of like peat smoke. We have a smoke box that is outside of the building that 4th day during germination, while the malt is still a little bit moist, probably like 24-25% moisture, we're going to smoke that malt. And when it is a little bit damp, that helps again with that bonding of those polyphenols and really makes a much more punchier, more pronounced mesquite note. You can smoke dry malt. A good example of that, if you're familiar at all with Andalusia in Texas, they're making some amazing single malts. They get their malt pre-malted, and they have this basically kind of modified shed that they're doing to smoke their malt. You can do that. You don't get quite the pronounced smoke flavor as you do if you're smoking during the germination and then kilning phase. But yeah, it's a lot of hard work, but it's really cool. And it's another way to kind of really put our thumbprint on it and to create something that is unique. And we call them fire days, the days we smoke. They're not too bad in the winter. I get in at about 5:30 in the morning. I want to make sure that the fire's going by 6. We try to get a solid 8-9 straight hours of smoke contact on it. It is unbelievably terrible in the summer because that smoke box will get upwards of 1,000 degrees. And so when it's 120 degrees out, middle of the afternoon, and you're standing out there trying to cool that smoke box down so you can switch fire out, it's something else. But again, it's what creates our Dorado. It's what creates what we've become known for. Again, this love letter to the Sonoran Desert.
If you're okay with talking a little bit about other distilleries, just by way of example, you already mentioned Andalusia, so I assume that's okay. I've been there. I interviewed them. That's an interview I haven't published yet.
Yes.
Yeah, that was super cool. Ty and Moose basically gave me the run of the place for about 6 hours. So it was a lot of spirits were consumed, among other things. That smoke, that little box there is like, it feels ingenious, right? It's the Texas smoking philosophy of, like, you know, the way that you would do meat, right? Like smoke it like you'd smoke on the barbecue, like on the smoker, not the barbecue. As a Texan, I should know better, right? Smoke like you'd smoke a brisket on the smoker. But in this case, using peat, which apparently at one point in time, I think they were getting it from Scotland, then they switched to Ireland. And I think they also said they have a source in the northern United States at this point. But I didn't take good enough notes to confirm that for real. So I'll have to go back. And one reason I haven't published that was because it was 6 hours of recorded content and it needs to be edited. There's a lot of information in there. So they are the point that I wanted to make is they're doing smoking on site.
Mm-hmm.
They're not doing malting on site. What they do is, as you said, they wet the barley and they smoke the already malted barley. Ty's assertion was that they had tried it both ways and found that there wasn't an appreciable difference between doing it one way or the other, but it was way more scalable to have the malt already malted for them. Mm-hmm. Right. Which sort of brings me into my next question. I want to underscore the fact that Whiskey Del Bach is one of the very few American distilleries that is doing their own malting in any capacity. If you throw a dart at a random distillery, even out of a relatively, elite set of distilleries that I particularly like, try to go one by one and go, do you do your own malting? The answer is almost always no. It's not a thing that a lot of distilleries are choosing to do. It has a little bit of, even in Scotland, we know that Lafroig's floor maltings are supplemented heavily by professional malting houses. Maybe you could speak a little bit to why this seems to be so rare.
It's a lot of work. It's a lot of room. It's a completely different art form and science. I think of Jared at Balcones in a similar conversation. I think it was the ACSA panel. Someone had asked, well, would you ever consider doing malting? And he was like, no, that is a completely, it is a beautiful, complex process. And, what maltsters are doing, they're creating amazing, high quality, interesting malts. And, for us, we're hyper specialized. We are making this one particular malt for our product. But yeah, it was one of the cool things when I was brought on board was like, I was really excited to learn how to malt. And when it's done, when it's done, we love it. Like when that product is finished and it's finally come out of the germination and kiln tank and it's in our silo and it's ready to produce, myself and Dustin and Abby, the production team, were like, this is awesome. This is so cool. And then malt week comes up again. And it is, again, it's a bunch of moving parts. I liken it to, like, you'll occasionally also get that question, like, would you as a distillery ever consider having your own cooperage? And while cool, it's such a unique thing and it's so different and it makes us unique. It gives us that control, but I do get it. Like I 100% understand that, like, if we're trying to be scalable, and you use the word scalable, like, that's the other thing is, like the original intent was Whiskey Del Bach was doing all of it. We were doing all of our own malting and realized pretty quickly when you can only do 5,000 pounds at a time and you're using 1,500 pounds of malt per batch, you're pretty much malting all the time too. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's really what it comes down to is a lot of the people I've talked to it's such a different process. To me, I love it because it helps better understand the process, to understand something intellectually, these are the steps that you go through to create this is different than knowing things practically. And this is what we're looking for to make sure we have enough moisture on that seed. This is what we're looking for when we know it's ready and time for us to apply the smoke to it. This is how we know when things have gone wrong, because that happens too. And, that also kind of helps assess outside malt when it comes through. Because I always tell people, like, we do a good job. We're not professional maltsters. Like, we send off for analyzation. We send off for our COAs, and we make what we need to make an amazing product. We'll occasionally have people ask us, well, would you ever consider selling malt to us? And we'll be like, we'll happily give you a little bit of malt. but just be aware, this is very, very niche and very kind of dialed into what we're doing.
All right. This feels like a good time to address some of the questions while we maybe still have some people on the line that asked questions in Instagram. I wasn't sure at first whether I wanted to ask this question, but just to do well by the audience, someone came in and basically said, why use Macallan 12 as the baseline, implying that that's a low bar?
Because it was Stephen and Elaine's go-to. It was an accessible, drinkable, daily drinker Scotch. For me, I've never been the biggest Macallan fan. Kind of similar, I feel it's not as interesting as I would like it to be. But I think that was kind of what that thought process was it's consistent. It is a popular, solidly made single malt. And, I think to me, obviously I can't speak to Stephen's thought process, but to me, that's where that thought has always come in. And to me, there's also something really honorable and admirable about wanting to create something that is good and consistent. I think I might be vaguely controversial. I think it's very easy to do one-off brilliance. I think it is very easy to go, we have this one thing and it's amazing, but we'll never be able to recreate it. It is really, really hard to be good consistently. And to me, I think that's something that's admirable to look to. And that's obviously we strive for excellence. We're always wanting to create something that is people sip and they go, oh my God, this is amazing. And I absolutely love what this is. But then to be able to do that consistently and to be able to grow on that and to create something that people then can look towards, I think that's where some of that inspiration came from. And to me, that's at least how I've kind of taken it for our production process, is consistently good.
All right, I've got a couple more questions, and I feel since everybody's doing shout outs of other distilleries, and I think that we like shouting out people doing positive, cool things.
Yes.
Talking about own maltings, not necessarily floor maltings, but distilleries that are doing their own maltings. I asked in the Society of Spirit, and the answers that I got were distilleries that are doing their own malting, floor malting or otherwise. Some answers I got: Copper Sea, Copper Fox, Stout Ridge, Del Bach, Mint and Mill.
Mm-hmm.
In the chat over here, we have Hill Rock, Leopold
yeah.
Bros.
I mean, Leopold Brothers, they have their own malt system, their own entire malt business. Yeah, that's...
Yep. And Beehive Distillery in Salt Lake City apparently does small batches of floor malting.
And that's awesome. And I love it. And to me, that underlines craft is kind of this ephemeral term. How do you define craft? Like ACSA, we have our definition of what craft is. But, to me, it's that level of obsession. Yeah, it's that level of care. And, for my part, I became a distiller because that level of intricacy. I went from being just an enthusiastic drinker and then writing about cocktails and then writing about spirits and then running a bar program and then making my own bitters, and then eventually had this opportunity to become a distiller. So what better way to control that than making the spirit itself? And then to get even further down, making your own malt. It's tough, but to me, that's what makes it interesting. And that's what makes it cool, is that level of care and that level of obsession. And to see people within the industry doing it, I have so much admiration for it. It's so cool what is happening within the craft spirits industry. And not only that it's good, I feel like we've really hit a stride within the industry. Unfortunately, for a long time, there was a lot of craft out there, but it wasn't that great. And I think you're seeing that mature. I think you're really starting to see that industry come into its own and realize what you can do to create things that are unique and create things that are interesting and to create things that people want to drink. Because that's also, at the end of the day, we're a business, and you've still got to be able to make something that people are interested in.
Yeah. So speaking of craft being no longer being a 4-letter word, as they say, right? Craft is not a bad word, but it used to be. So there are some people who will refuse to drink something that they know to be a craft whiskey because they assume it will have crafty characteristics like maybe raw grain, or it tastes too young, or other such things like that. And if you think about it, those are problems that will get cured with time. Either those barrels just needed more time, or just a couple of more iterations. So again, time. And we're decades into the craft spirits movement now. It's not beyond the realm of imagination to believe that there should be a few dozen really good distilleries that are still calling themselves craft. And that craft definition that is used by ACSA, for example, which is about whether you're majority owned by a public company, you're not craft anymore, or just a matter of size.
Mm-hmm.
Something that stood out to me, actually, among the entrants into that the spirits judging competition, and the people who were there for American Single Malt Whiskey Commission meeting, a lot of the distilleries that I would have thought of as craft American single malt no longer qualify for one reason or another, right?
Mm-hmm.
I could maybe argue that by philosophy, Westland is still craft, but they're owned by Remy now,
right?
So they are no longer considered craft. But I think their scale is also too large, if I'm not mistaken.
I think our cap is 100,000 PGs, proof gallons per year. I always have to look that up.
Some large enough number.
Yeah.
Not a number that's gonna like make anything click in anyone's head, I think. So
right. It's very inside baseball.
Yeah, it's probably not worth like figuring out that exact line. But one of the things that surprised me, how to phrase this, I was pleasantly surprised that Whiskey Del Bach was still craft and that you swept the competition. Like
that was
every bottle that you entered got a gold, I think, maybe except for one.
Yeah, that was so unreal. That was so cool. Yeah, we submitted all 6 of what we call our core products, which would be Classic Dorado, the Frontera, Normandy, Ode to Isla, and then our Sentinel Rye. And Classic Dorado, Normandy, and Ode all got golds. And then we still got a bronze for the Frontera and a bronze for the Sentinel. So everything medaled. So like that was just, and hugely humbling. Like, and that's the thing is like, we had this conversation a lot of like, obviously we like what we're doing. You know, we're putting it into a bottle and we're telling people you should spend, this is worth $60. We were saying this is a $60 bottle. And so, you know, to me, that takes a level of confidence in your product, but to have that, have other people say, yeah, we 100% are with you on this, that this is something that is well made. This is something that is worth purchasing. And what's cool about the ACSA competition is, you know, that's being judged by your peers. And, you know, this is other distillers and not just craft distillers. You know, on the judging committee, you have people like Nicole Austin, who, you know, is, I can't remember what her title is now, but Grand Poobah of luxury whiskey at Diageo. I mean, so, you know, these are people who know what they're doing. And, you know, it's so humbling, and it makes it really worth it, of like things like that. When you go, yeah, like our peers are saying you're doing a really good job. And yeah, that was a crazy day. And to me, it's awesome because like that also like validates the work that like the production crew does. You know, because I try to be very conscientious of, you know, I'm not by myself back there. You know, I'm lucky enough that, you know, I get to oversee the day-to-day. I'm lucky enough that I get to do things like this and talk about it. But, you know, Dustin and Abby are the ones that are covered in grain dust, doing that work day in, day out. And then, you know, to be able to text them that day and just be like, hey, just so you know, the juice you're making, people love. And I'm bringing this hardware home for all of us. So.
And By the way, I'm just going to call out once more to the Instagram chat. The Whiskey Shaman is watching us on the Instagram chat and is commenting along that all of this stuff is really good. Del Box stood out recently in a blind, which is awesome. Oh, was that the Freedom Malts blind, by the way, Whiskey Shaman? That would be funny if it was. Dorado is a great pour, he says. He believes, I think this was about Andalusia's peat. It might be Missouri peat now. I think that's right. And he also agrees craft is getting real good right now. And I'm repeating all of those comments because the YouTube chat can't see them. So I figured that I should I should at least echo what's going on Instagram.
Yeah, no, that's awesome.
All right, I have thoughts on the fact that Frontera didn't get a gold.
Right?
Because we actually talked about this at ACSA, right? This exact question, this exact Frontera didn't get a gold is what I was like, how does this work? And I've been trying to figure out how whiskey spirits judging competitions work now.
So this one is interesting. So another reason I really like ACSA is, unlike a lot of the other bigger competitions, you get notes. Like, you get the sheet that the judge filled out. And to me, that's invaluable. Like, to have a blind tasting and to have people saying, these are things I really liked. These are things you could have worked on. These are things that just didn't strike me. We could have, if I recall correctly, we could have gotten a gold on the Frontera if not for one judge who really didn't like it.
Okay.
Like, the majority of them were like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is so interesting. The sherry cask comes through. It's beautifully married. And there was one judge that was just like, nope, off balance, tastes thin, tastes hot, 65 points. So that just brought the average down. But that's how it works. And again, like, and if everything's, I always say it'd be really boring if we all liked the same things. Like, if there was some weird random arbiter of what is high quality and what isn't, that'd be really boring. So, you take it with a grain of salt. If they're thoughtful, negative, if it's constructive criticism, that's great. And I do genuinely feel like those judges' points of feedback were constructive. It wasn't just I don't like this, or this is off base, or this is off category.
Right. Or it has off flavors, maybe. So it was really just a preference thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I always wonder that. I mean, I got into this. I always love hearing the stories from distillers about how you got to where you are now, because I see myself a little bit in that story where I started off falling in love with a particular style of whiskey that led to me falling in love with American single malt. I decided I wanted to start writing reviews about whiskey and then focus on reviews of American single malt. And then that somehow one thing led to another. And now I have a podcast, right? There was a book that was supposed to happen. It became a podcast so I could do the primary research. And there's a book that's going to be coming. That's the plan. And I don't know. I think Phil wouldn't be surprised if in a decade I'm at a distillery.
I mean, I'm hoping that in a decade I'm at a distillery.
I hope so too. It's always one of those weird, I get asked that question a lot. Like, okay, if someone wants to get into this, like if someone wants to become a distiller, like, what's your advice? And I was very lucky. Like, that's literally, I was in the right place at the right time. I'd run a little bar program. I'd been writing about spirits, writing about cocktails for about 8 years. My main job was PR and marketing. I was the director of communications for a relatively large company, and that paid the bills. And then my passion was spirits and food and doing all of this. And, I've got to give a shout out to Hayes Kellman, who is one of the founders of Boot Hill Distillery, which is my first distillery. Like, where I got my start was he took a risk on me. He reached out to me and he was like, hey, Boot Hill was founded by a group of farmers, and my communications job was for an ag company. And it was a distillery opening in my hometown of Dodge City, Kansas. And it was farmers opening a distillery. So I had that connection, and it was them going, well, booze, ag, would you have any interest in, I really started out, like, I think the first pitch was like, do you want to come on as a consultant? Like, literally just occasionally taste stuff and go, yeah, that's good, or no, that's bad. And I think 2 days later after that conversation, they had posted for a part-time events manager and a part-time assistant distiller. And I called Hayes and I was like, hey, crazy idea. What about if you bring me on as your director of marketing and as your production distiller? And he was like, yeah, that sounds great. And so right place, right time. I'd been there long enough. I had those connections, and I was lucky enough that I had someone that was willing to take that risk on me and to take on someone who, again, knowing things intellectually, like I intellectually knew how booze was made, how different products were made. But then you actually get in front of a still and it's a completely different, oh, wow, like I have no idea what I'm doing now. And to me, that's the advice I usually give is, if you're passionate about it, it'll happen. And sometimes you just have to be at the right place at the right time. That I'm not saying I haven't worked hard, but a lot of it was luck. A lot of it was just, I happened to be right there when they needed somebody. And so I'm forever thankful for that, because it was within a year that I was like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I mean, it was an immediate just falling in love. And the industry is amazing, coming from PR and marketing, which was so cutthroat. And so you would try to create this sense of community, you'd be like, hey, I want to network with other professionals. And it was almost always you were getting undercut. Well, I need to make myself look better. I need to make my company look better. And I think like 6 months into distilling, I had a couple of contacts that I had known from my writing days, and something went like disastrously wrong at the distillery. And I called them and I was like, I'm in so much trouble. I need help. And they were like, no problem. We got you. And like it was just immediate. Like, you have some bad actors in the industry, but for the most part, everyone in this industry is so supportive. And like I love seeing like the comments you were saying were coming up on Instagram, like calling out other distilleries. Like, it's not this we're all fighting over the same piece of pie. It is this, we're trying to make a bigger pie. And what we're creating is something that is totally different, and that you can recognize that quality. And I'm also like always happy to tell people, especially like within the American single malt space, because you have these variations, even if you didn't like our stuff, that doesn't mean you don't like American single malt. It could just be you don't like how we're doing it. And so try Westland, try Westward, try Root Shoot out of Colorado, try Boulder, try Virginia. Like there's so many people and so many great up and comers too that are just doing really cool stuff that, you love to see that support.
It's always interesting to me how people have a sort of a bias toward their own region when they're listing distilleries, right? I need to talk to more people who are from, California, who are from the High Plains, who are from, I'm from Texas, so I feel like I have a handle on that. But like people who are from the East Coast, right? Because when they start listing American single malt whiskey or distilleries or craft distilleries, they think geographically, right? One thing, what they have access to, and also like what's near them that they have a connection to. Like, whiskey is connection. And I want to know all of American single malt whiskey. I've given myself a big job, and it's sometimes hard for me to get out of the rut of thinking about this Pacific Northwest area and the really large players that I've heard about, like the people with big reputations, regardless of size, like people with big reputations. Like Del Bach is a craft size distillery, but I heard about Del Bach like a long time ago, right? I mean, we've had you tentatively on the docket to show up on this show since October, I think. So it's been
that sounds about right.
Well, and just having heard about Whiskey Del Bach in conversation with people all over the country, talking about, really cool, interesting distilleries that they either have visited or want to visit, or who make a whiskey that they are fond of. It's interesting how widespread the reach of some distilleries are versus others. Like, I have a friend who is up in Minnesota, way up north in Minnesota, who has a pretty deep collection of Del Bach releases because that is his favorite whiskey. Notably, he isn't really a whiskey drinker. But it's sort of interesting to hear, people outside of Virginia calling out the Virginia Distillery Company, Copper Fox. There's a really new one way down south, moving into Blacksburg from where they previously were, J.H. Bard's, and hearing people from outside of my state name them is really cool to me because I think of them as being, really local, but they have a massive impact. Del Bach has a massive impact in Boulder Spirits, and it's really cool to just see how much impact making a really solid product has.
Yeah, and it's a testament to what Stephen and Amanda created. I think one of the advantages that Whiskey Del Bach has had since the beginning, because I've been here 3 years now, is because same, like I was back east, I was in Maryland, and I had heard of Whiskey Del Bach, and I had heard really good things about Whiskey Del Bach, and that clarity of vision, that ability to kind of come in and say, this is what we're making, and we're going to be focused on quality. We're going to be unerring in what our goal is, and that is to create an American single malt that is of its place. And I think, to me, that's also what you're seeing then with a lot of these other people coming up, is having that knowledge of, this is what I want to be, like, this is what I want to create, this is how I want to set this apart, and then moving forward with that. And also, like we keep talking about, at the end of the day, being good. You can have a great story, you can have an interesting concept, but you still have to sell the bottle at the end of the day. But yeah, and it was one of the things that drew me to Whiskey Del Bach was Stephen and Amanda's story is amazing, and it was so clearly defined of what it wanted to be, and they're also just amazing people. Like, that was another thing. Like, when I started interviewing, it was very much like, this is where I would really like to be. And having heard that positive reputation of Whiskey Del Bach, and to me, like, I think it comes back, and I think is a huge thing too, is coming back to craft coming into its own. Kind of, there's always going to be, I think, that throwing stuff up against the wall, seeing what's going to stick, but learning those lessons and saying, okay, this is what worked, this is what didn't work. And I can't say that consumers don't always fall for just really good marketing, but I do think consumers are very savvy. And I think, especially in people who consume craft, they've gotten pretty good at sniffing out disingenuous companies. And yeah, your branding's great, your story's great, but there's not a single authentic bone in your body. And authenticity, I think, is something that you just can't trade in, you can't phone in, for the most part. Maybe that's me being idealistic.
I mean, there's also the concept of, it's really easy to sell someone the first one. Selling the second means that the first one that you sell them has to be good. And that is sort of a concept that transcends what is, or transcends the spectrum of things that people sell. I heard that from, weirdly, somebody who was a representative of a massive musical instrument manufacturer. But that is sort of the catch. Like, there are so many brands that, flash in the pan, get a really big start and sell a lot, and then sort of peter out because they focused on, that bright flash and all the marketing, and maybe not as much on, having a unique and interesting product that drew people in and that they could sell more of.
All right, not that we've gone too far off, but I want to try to bring this train back to the tracks just a little bit. So one thing that we don't have, I don't think Phil has either, is the Ode to Isla. So far we've been working our way from no smoke to a little bit of smoke to theoretically, if we had Ode to Isla, we could talk about the most smoke, even though we don't have it to taste. Actually, so before I make that assumption, we might have something similar. Phil, do you have Mega Mesquite? Okay, I do. I don't know how similar Mega Mesquite would be to Ode to Isla. If it's appropriate, I'll pour a glass.
So Mega Mesquite's actually even smokier than the Ode
Okay.
to Isla.
Okay.
That's a couple of things. We've kind of tweaked how we do some of our smoke production. But yeah, I may have a bottle of Ode to Isla, but I'd hate to leave Phil out of this. So I would just have to briefly sneak away to my bar.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't mind being left out of this one. I've got plenty of glasses over here that I can enjoy in the meantime.
Okay, I will be right back if that's okay. I know I'm doing this on a live stream, which is kind of
totally.
remote.
I'll read some comments. Yeah. So Freedom Malts, I apologize. I haven't been reading your comments so far, but now's a great time. I will get to that question. That's a good question about regions if we have time. So Freedom Malts has had Dorado, Desert Dessert, and is now pouring Frontera. That was 10 minutes ago. So now he says that he's pouring the Mega Mesquite. So cheers to that. Whiskey Shaman says his favorite is Ode to Isla and the Summer 23 release, which reminds me. So I have a fun story about that. I don't know whether this is true, but some of you may remember that we used to have another co-host who in theory could come back at any time, but he's running tours at Del Bach right now. So Ian, who we refer to as Spooky Chicken, was our original contact with Del Bach, and he was a co-host of our show when we were just a topic show before we had interviews. He told me that there was a shipment out to me of Del Bach bottles, which included, I believe, the Summer 23 release. That shipment never made its way to my door, right? Never showed up. Why? I am told, I haven't confirmed this. Maybe Mark can confirm this, but I was told there was an incident with bottles exploding on the back of a truck because it was so hot in Arizona this past summer that not only my shipment, but many other shipments didn't get to their destination.
Oh yeah, I have some PTSD from this last summer.
Oh man.
Yeah, we had this horrific heat dome come in. I want to say it was 5 weeks where it was above 110 degrees every day in a row. And you do what you can. We try to have tight fitting corks. We have the capsule that seals it. We dropped the summer 2023 Distiller's cut. It went out, and I want to say within like a week, we had almost a dozen that had come back to us that it had gotten so hot, it had just completely, literally blown the cork. And I'm like, these are corks. Like these are closures. And even with them in, even with that capsule sealing, it was getting so hot that it was pushing that out. And so we were getting these phone calls of, hey, I just got the bottle and it's a quarter empty because it just blew the top. And so a lot of UPS trucks smelled amazing. But yeah, it was, we had to suspend shipments for almost a month, which is not unheard of in the wine world, but it really did just hit a point that we're like, we can't send anything out right now because we can't guarantee that it's going to arrive safe and sound. So yeah, that was a whole thing. Plus we also had some faulty closures around the same time too. So this was just like this, we got a bad shipment of closures. We have this horrific heat wave. Bottles are popping. Having to handle those phone calls, that was always fun.
Yeah.
Having
sorry to bring that back up.
No, it is true. It is, yeah.
having
the
stood
disadvantages of
in
living in
the
the desert.
in the back of a UPS truck here in the summer and helped unload some things here, way less than 110 degrees, stepping into the back of a UPS baggage van to help them unload some heavy stuff was probably one of the worst experiences I had that summer. And it wasn't near 110 degrees of mercury. It was, I can't imagine how hot the backs of those vans actually were.
Well, and you're in Virginia, so you have the disadvantage of humidity. Like,
Well,
at
yeah.
least it's that terrible joke. Oh, it's a dry heat, but it's true. At least it's a dry heat. But yeah, the back of those are getting up to 300, 400 degrees. Like, and then we started to worry about, well, okay, at that level of heat, you're doing damage to the whiskey itself. Like you're starting to break that down. And so yeah, that is probably a thought process I'm going to have coming up in this summer, because with the increased heat, with these heat domes that we've now had 2 summers in a row of, it's also had an impact on our angel share. Like our loss, which was already terrible. Like we were already averaging 10% a year. We're like up to 13, 14, 15% now because of these heat. Yeah. So
on that note, yeah, I mean, like let's just follow that train of thought. So on that note, what is the typical age of your whiskey?
So this is I'm always happy to kind of blow people's minds or completely turn them off sometimes. Our core SKUs, so the Classic and the Dorado, are about a year old. It's 12 months on average.
Wow.
Yeah.
So for anyone anyone who's looking and not just listening, look at the color on that and tell me that looks like it's a year old.
So yeah, so we do a couple of things that are unique. Like I said, what our challenges we try to lean into and regard as positives or opportunities. So like for our yeast strain, we're using a genus of yeast that is, or excuse me, a style of yeast that is bred specifically for 100% malt fermentations, but can also handle temperatures up to 95 degrees. We try not to get that warm, but the chiller will break down. And so we need a yeast that's going to handle that stress going up that high. We do very quick fermentations where our fermentation is done in about 4 days. We also make very narrow cuts on our second, because we do double copper pot distillation. We go into quarter casks. We go into 15-gallon barrels. So we're also, like 2 things that always kind of make people raise their eyebrow. We're using small format barrels, and we're doing short aging. But my argument is always, there's been a bad rap with small format barrels because you have to know how to utilize them. A lot of people have been like, I'm going to produce a new make that I'm producing as I would for a 53, but then I'm going to put it into a 15. And what ends up happening is, like, what is regarded as like a flaw or unpleasant notes in new make, they're going to esterify, they're going to oxidize, they're going to meld, they're going to create really interesting things when they have time to sit in a 53. When you go into a smaller format, I hate this term because it's very PR-y and marketing, but it's the hearts of the hearts. It is, we are making a very narrow hearts cut because we don't have that time to let like those fusel oils and like that acetaldehyde and things like that kind of esterify. So we have to find this balance of narrow cuts so you don't have those off flavors, but not so narrow that all you taste is oak. Because you can also make way too narrow cuts. Your spirit's too neutral. And when it interacts with oak, it's just
oak juice.
Nothing but the wood. Yeah. And so, yeah, so we have that advantage also, those 30 to 40 degree shifts in a single day. When you pay attention, when you utilize it, it's not an efficient way to do it. I will always tell people that, like, it is not an efficient way to make whiskey, but I think kind of the results speak for themselves. One of my favorite reactions I've ever had is we had a gentleman in from Las Vegas, a relatively well-known bar owner and mixologist, and absolute just gem of a human. And we're taking him through the distillery, and you can tell he's a little wary. He's like, "Oh, small barrels. Oh, this is 12 months. Okay." And like, he's, I think, kind of humoring us, like, okay, what are these guys on? And so we sit down for the tasting and we pour everything, and he takes the classic, and he goes, 12 months? Yeah, 12 months. Yeah, that's
not years.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's our average for our core. Our special releases, so our Frontera, which is our Pedro Jimenez sherry finish, our Normandy, which is the Calvados finish, and then the Ode to Isla, which is our heavy smoked. Those are anywhere from 2 to 3 years. We're doing that initial 12 months, 15 months max on the initial age, and then that finish can be anywhere from 12 months to 18 to 20. I always give the obnoxious answer, well, how old or when do you know when to pull it? Well, when it's ready. We'll do sensory on it, and when we're like, yep, this is when it's ready, we'll pull it. So that could be shorter time, that could be longer time. We also do utilize a lot of different stages of usage for our finishing barrels. So we have some first use, third use, up to fifth use. So you can let those ride a little bit longer the more they've been used, because you're getting less of that impact of, say, that sherry or that Calvados cask. But with that first use, you're not going to let it ride very long, because otherwise it's going to completely overpower it. And you're going to end up with something, to me, like, I still want to be able to taste that core spirit. I want it to be something that you can recognize as Del Bach, but it is elevated and has a little bit more nuance in it from that finishing. So you talked about Ode to Isla and the Mega Mesquite.
Yeah. So yeah, I was going to come back to it. Yeah. So I just had to check the specs real quick. So Mega Mesquite is one of the single distillery series, which means it's multiple barrels as opposed to a single barrel from Lost Lantern. So Lost Lantern Mega Mesquite says 1 year old. Amazingly, 3 barrels. It has 180 bottles. That makes a lot more sense when we're looking at the 15-gallon barrels. So what I was checking was, were all of these the heavily mesquite smoked casks? And yes, they were. So this theoretically is basically the smokiest expression possible from your liquid.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of different variations.
It's beautiful. So I think you're gonna about to say the question, basically. So this is beautiful. What I have heard is that sometimes when you go in with heavily mesquite smoked whiskey and nothing else, and you don't temper it with the unsmoked whiskey, it comes across as too harsh. But this is not like that at all. This is beautiful and round. So is that just is it a change over time that it's become softer, or that the style is developed in such a way that it comes out this way, or were these just honey casks?
So with those were honey casks. Those were private barrels we had pulled. So typically, as we go through, we do, each spirit run gets us anywhere from 12 to 14 barrels per run. And so we will typically sensory those lots all at the same time. So we'll be like, okay, we had these 12 go down on the same day. We're going to taste them and make sure they're good. If we have ones that really pop, they're like, wow, this is interesting. This is complex. This can stand on its own. We set those aside as private barrels. When Adam and Nora came out, we presented them with pretty much all of our mesquite smoked private barrels that we had, that were like, these are ones that are beautiful. They're nuanced. And then, Adam and Nora are brilliant. They just absolutely crushed that blend. Like, they picked 3. And if I recall correctly, those 3 casks, which is what makes blending amazing, and I think I'm so glad we're focusing on blending as an industry more, they just came together so beautifully. And so that's something we try to pay a lot of attention to as well, is, not just laying stuff down. Okay, cool. It's 12 months. We're going to pull it out. We're going to throw it into a bottle. Like, being a little more conscientious of, is this a little too astringent? Is this a little too soft? Because that'll happen sometimes too. You'll get a barrel that you're like, I'm barely getting any smoke off of this, but a lot of like butterscotch notes. We get a lot of those vanillas, those wood sugars. And that's where Ode to Isla came in, is so the Dorado, we've adjusted that smoke level down. It is much less smoky than it used to be. Again, smoke's divisive. And so as we kind of listened to consumer feedback, there was this, hey, sometimes I like a lot of smoke, but mesquite in particular, if you overdo it, it does become very astringent. It becomes very unpleasant on the palate. And so with the Dorado, we do blend some classic in. With the Mega Mesquite, with the Ode to Isla, we actually don't add any unsmoked into it. So it's just paying very close attention to the barrels that are going into it, and really kind of throwing back to what Dorado used to be, because we do still have some smokeheads. We do still have some people who've been fans from the beginning that are like, oh yeah, don't get me wrong, I still like Dorado, but man, I really miss that old Dorado.
So you brought back Ode to Isla as you said no, not tempered at all by unsmoked whiskey. It is purely smoked whiskey. So
It is purely
essentially your core lineup of no finishing casks so far, I
Mhm.
believe, in what we've talked about. Classic is no smoke, no
Mhm.
smoked whiskey. Dorado is a mix of smoked and unsmoked whiskey. And Ode to Isla is fully smoky whiskey.
Mhm.
All smoked.
Yeah.
Okay,
used to
so
be called a
that's just a
winter release.
PSA to the audience. If you want to know which of these bottles you should go pick up, that's why. That's the explanation.
And not to try and tease a bottle that is really difficult to get, because the Ode comes out every winter, and there's a handful of places that still have it in stock, but it's pretty much sold out. The TAG Global Spirits competition in Las Vegas just announced their results, and Ode to Isla got best of show. So not to oversight people thank you. Another one, like nothing got below a gold. We got golds, double golds, platinums, and a best of show. So shameless self-promotion.
Fair enough.
But yeah, the Ode's one of my favorites. And, obviously we're proud of everything, but the Ode to us is, again, going back to the roots. We used to call it the winter release. When we did a big rebranding and created our what we call our global cask collection, which are the white labels. That's kind of just a way to bring it back to what we used to be and be like, we still haven't forgotten those of you who love smoke.
Yep. All right. So I have a question from Freedom Malts, which I think is a good question, but I want to add some clarification to it. So roughly what percentage of the barley gets smoked overall at the distillery? And what percentage of the barley in Dorado is smoked?
So I'm gonna have to. So I can tell you. So the mash bill for Dorado, or what eventually becomes Dorado, for our heavy smoked, is actually 60% unsmoked, 40% smoked. So even then, we're tempering with a lot of unsmoked malt going into that mash bill. With Ode to Isla, we will do a couple of runs that are 100% mesquite smoked. We'll mix in some heavier, like we'll switch that to like 60% mesquite, 40% unsmoked. In terms of like actual percentage of like what we're utilizing within the distillery, majority is going to be unsmoked. And that's just because obviously the classic, and then some of that unsmoked is going into even that Dorado base. I just lost my train of thought that was tied in with that. It was in terms of like, we find ourselves malting more often though, and we do find ourselves using the smoked malt a little bit more, because for a long time, classic was our top seller. It was around like, I want to say like 60% classic, 40% Dorado. And then last year was the first year we ever broke 50-50, where we sold 50% classic, 50% Dorado. And we're on track this year for Dorado to overtake classic for the first time. And so, trying to extrapolate out and figure out how we're developing into the future, we are doing more and more of that smoked malt. And there's so many variations too. Like, and I kind of put the caveat that those are rough percentages. We have to do sensory on everything. We're trying to wrangle natural processes. And sometimes we get batches of mesquite wood that are really powerful, and we just get this batch of malt that just you can smell the smoke for days. And then sometimes we do production the exact same way, and just for whatever reason we don't get that same smoke bond, and so we will tweak that mash bill based on say like our phenol levels.
Yeah, so this is a great question. I had the same question when I first learned the name. So Ode to Isla is not finished in an Isla barrel.
It is not. It is the first year release was finished in bourbon barrels we had. This year, or this last year's, and pretty much the forthcoming years are finished in rye. It's interesting. Peat and mesquite tend to not work very well together. you can do it. You know, you have to be very conscientious of what your proportions are, but you know, all smoke is not created equal, and not all smoke is complementary. And we've talked to some people, we've played around with blending mesquite with peat, and it tends to just create something that is lesser than the sum of its parts. For us, it is just because it's heavily smoked. It is our ode to the Islay style of Scotch.
Yep, makes sense to me. I'll admit that it took me a minute to come around on that because, you know, Islay really evokes for peat heads like me this idea that, oh, there's going to be some, you know, Ardbeg style peat smoke in that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a certain character of the smoke that you expect in that. And then you're told, oh, there's actually no Islay, there's no peat, there's no Islay casks, there's none of that in this. It's just extra smoky.
Mm-hmm.
And then you taste it. And I'll admit I haven't had an Ardbeg or a Lagavulin or anything like that next to these, but in isolation, the Smoky Del Bach really comes across. I mean, it has that mesquite character, but the smoke character isn't so different from Islay smoke that it feels like I'm missing out, right? It really does feel like it's scratching that same smoky whiskey itch that I want it to scratch. You know, I was like, oh, I'm going to have some of this. And if I'm not satisfied with the smoky quality, then I'll go pour this, you know, this other peated whiskey that I have nearby. I had no interest in that. In fact, as I was tasting through these, we're about to get into the sherried expressions that you have. I was like, oh, except that it's really late and I need to go to sleep. I actually really want to pour a sherry bomb next to this because that's the comparison that feels more worth doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
So one last question before we move into the sherried stuff. I just want to double check. So all the mesquite smoked malt that you have, that's malted in-house. Is that correct? Or do you send it away?
Yeah, that is 100% of the mesquite smoked malt is in-house.
Okay. And Freedom Malt says the Mega Mesquite is freaking amazing. And yes, it is. And I was trying not to say too much because I didn't want Phil to feel left out. So yeah, let's move on. So we've got Frontera up next in my lineup.
Yes.
At least how I imagine the next thing to do is.
So
that's this one.
So we've kind of touched base on it a little bit. So we have what we call our distiller's cuts. These have kind of been ways for us to be a little more creative, create different expressions. Again, one of the things we're focused on is consistency. And, you know, consistency is kind of factory work. It's doing the same thing day in, day out, making sure we're hitting those specs. And so the distiller's cuts are a way to be creative, just kind of go off the wall. We had noticed that we had a handful that people really loved. One of them being a Pedro Jimenez finish. And so we had this discussion of like, for the distiller's cuts, you've got to come to the distillery. It's a way to draw people in so we can show them the space, and they're super limited runs. I mean, this last distiller's cut was 504 bottles. I mean, it's a small run. So like, how can we expand that reach, get people interested, and also scale it, you know, make it consistent, make it so more people could have access. And so that's how Frontera was born, was because the Pedro Jimenez finish was so popular. We started playing around with that, and we're like, let's take advantage of it. We got our hands on a couple of additional PX Sherry Botas. And so this is our classic. So again, that initial aging in the new oak and then finished in Pedro Jimenez Sherry. And one of the reasons I kind of loved it is, to me, I think there's a lot of sweetness or implied sweetness that's already in the classic. You get that dark chocolate, you get those stone fruits. And because Pedro Jimenez is such a typically sweet sherry, like you would think that would muddle it, like that it would just kind of weigh it down. But to me, it had the exact opposite effect. Like some of that walnut, some of that bright grape skin just really accentuated some of the things that were already going on within the classic.
Yeah. So tell a quick story, and I'm going to talk about another distillery. So Westland just had their like archive sale. At this point, I have fully founded. I experiment sometimes, especially if they have an open bottle. But in terms of what I'm going to buy blind from Westland, if it's peated in a sweet wine cask, doesn't have to be sherry, some kind of sweet dessert wine cask, I will buy that almost without question because I love that profile. I love it from Weston. I love it from everybody, right? My favorite whiskeys by far. Heavily smoky, sweet wine cask. I love desert dessert as well. This is everything I want from a sherry bomb. The Frontera PX. It's beautiful.
Thank you. I'm going to have to, now that you've said that, our Fall 22 Distiller's Cut is one of my favorites that we've ever done. And it is our heavily smoked MS finished in Pinot de Charance. And it is beautiful. In fact, we loved it so much, 1% of every Dorado blend has that Pinot de Charance finish in it. So may have to find a way to get those into your guys' hands. Mm.
The dead air tells you that it's working. This is
so
really
I've been sitting with this, trying to find the off balance, and the only thing that I can think of is that it is heavy on the bright, top end notes, and it has a decent mid range, but it doesn't have a lot of the like deep, low, dark flavors. And I think that might be it, but depending on what you're looking for, like this is an absolutely wonderful dessert dram.
So you're saying you feel there's a slight imbalance and you're trying to figure out what that is?
Well, no. I mean, I don't think it's unbalanced. I think that if your expectation is for it to run, soprano, alto, tenor, baritone, bass, and you are expecting like a nice rich bass, and it isn't there because this is more of a top end choir, I guess you could feel that it's off balance, but I think that it isn't missing anything for not having the deep low notes.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think I know where you're coming from. Maybe a little more barrel would help it feel fuller on the bottom, but I also don't feel like I need or want that necessarily. Like it could be there, but it doesn't matter that it isn't, if that makes sense. It's not totally like lacking, right? It's a question of levels, right? It could be more, but it doesn't need to be.
Sorry, we have an interloper. My cat has joined the discussion. So
is this Gato del Bac or another cat?
No, this is Rump Roast. This is this is my wife and I's cat. No, Turo Gato del Bac. She lives at the distillery, so that is her domain.
I love Rump Roast as a cat name.
He's a rump roast too. He's oh my goodness. He's a big chunk.
All right. While we're enjoying our sips of this whiskey, before we move on to the next one, I want to ask before we run out of time. I saw that you have a tattoo on your arm of a molecule. I didn't see the whole thing. What is that molecule?
Ethanol.
Okay, that's what I thought, but I couldn't see the whole thing before. So
yeah, it's my nerdy distiller's tattoo.
It's awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, I got it around the time that I was like, this is what I want to do. And, you'll hear people like, will get things like Uzga Brea or Water of Life, Eau de Vie, things like that. And I'm like, I'm not Scottish. I'm not Irish. Don't feel like I have access to the Gaelic. And so I was like, you know what? Let's just do something stupid and nerdy. And so the chemical bond for ethanol. The joke I used to make was it's also a reminder of what I'm supposed to do during the day. Shit, what's I doing today? Oh, right. Oh. Booze. We're making booze.
That's good. Sometimes the simplest designs are the ones that are really...
What?
All right. So from here, and I do want to speed this along just slightly because we're getting close to our 2-hour mark. We have one more, which is the Distiller's Cut Spring 2024. And then after that, we're going to talk about the Sentinel Rye.
Yes.
So Distiller's Cut 2024, spoilers for everyone, is a complex beast.
It is also so dark in color.
Yeah.
Like,
so yeah, exactly. This is a half-size bottle, and it's one of the darker things I own.
And something we're also very proud of, we do not add any coloration. We are 100%, this is what it comes out of the bottle as. So we were talking about the Distiller's Cut and kind of a way to create things that maybe you aren't expecting, ways to kind of catch people off guard, ways to kind of push what you can do within the single malt category. And I've been told I shouldn't call it this, but I'm going to anyway. This is kind of a hobo chili of a blend.
I can see why you say that.
Yeah.
I had to read the bottle twice. If you'll indulge me, can I just read the bottle?
Oh, yes, please do.
So skipping the editorializing, what's in here is the classic finished in cognac, PX sherry, and rum agricole barrel finishes, which is then bolstered by a single barrel chosen from the private barrel selection. And then all of that blended together is secondary finished in cognac and Calvados barrels before being reblended, married, and bottled at cask strength. So, yep. And you can see why I had to read that twice. There are 2 components in 3 different barrel finishes that they then all come out, go into a blend together, and get refinished and blended together and released. It's definitely the multi-step recipe cookbook style of whiskey here. So I can see where you're coming from with hobo chili.
Yeah, and God, pity the wonderful front of house people at the distillery, Ian among them, who, when I told them what the blend was, to a T said, "I'm not remembering that." So just say from a variation of cask finishes.
I will say there's another thing about this label that I happen to know is one of your favorite things. So Mark writes the tasting notes for the bottles, and most of the time, if I understand correctly, they are not too heavily filtered through the marketing department. Sometimes they go, what's this all about? And this label is a story of one that got through. So there's a note on here called Bee Balm Blossom, which you told me is, if you know, you know.
Yes.
Could you tell us about that tasting note?
Yeah. So, like I had mentioned, so I came to Whiskey Del Bach to Tucson via Maryland, and the distillery I was at in Maryland, we did seasonal liqueurs. And one of the things that I love to play around with is Bee Balm Blossom, which is this very beautiful flower that has this very interesting, very specific scent and taste. I've said it's akin to chamomile, but not nearly as heavy. And so I will write the tasting notes, and they will go out to management and to the group to be like, hey, does this all make sense? And shout out to Steven, who he's reading through the tasting notes and he says, okay, I'm on board with all of these. Is Bee Balm Blossom a little too esoteric? Like, how many people are we going to lose for this?
It would not be on the East Coast, because we've got a bunch in our yard
and to me, it's just such an evocative, floral, beautiful note. And like the moment that we had finished that secondary finishing, and, we let it marry for a little over a month before it went into the bottle. And just immediately I was taken back to spring in Maryland. And like, to me, it's one of the things that I love. We talk about like whiskey bringing people together, and there's a lot of science to it, but then there's that art. And to me, it's the things that are evocative, like the things that you have that immediate clarity of recollection of, this is what I'm thinking of. And so that was one that I did say, I'm willing to be overruled. Like if we are too far out in left field, I'm fine with that. But just know, when I talk to people, I'm going to tell them this is what I get.
Yeah, so normally I like to, especially for complex ones like this, we didn't do so much with tasting notes with the rest of them because I feel like general vibes, we were kind of getting it. This is a whiskey that I would say demands analysis, right? This is a whiskey that I actually stopped drinking it early last night because I was like, my palate is too fried to appreciate this right now. So, Phil, if you want to hazard some tasting notes, since I'm spoiled by what's written on the bottle, I'll let you take the floor.
Whole apple tarts, like that nice bready crust, the like peel on apple slices, brown sugar, cinnamon, baked and then topped with honey. That's like one of the primary tasting notes that I'm getting.
That's a complex tasting note, and I get where you're coming from on that for sure. Cinnamon tarts with caramel sauce, yeah.
With the peel on, not one of those pansy, oh yeah, we gotta peel the apples all the way before it goes in. Nah, you need that little bit of that little bit of bitter in there.
A little bit of that rustic, right? You've done the caramel reductions with the slices of apples in the pan. And maybe you let it catch just a little bit. There's an edge of charred caramel to this as well. Now, thank you for giving me that description well in advance about what Bee Balm Blossom was, because I don't know that flower, but it did set me up to understand it. So I would never call that tasting note, but I can see what you mean. That sort of chamomile, but not.
And that apple, because to me, like chamomile has that very kind of green apple note to it.
There's something that I'm like, my brain is digging for something. Like, actually, let's take a big step back. So one of these whiskeys gave me a core memory. It's always good when you get those core memory unlocks, right? So Dorado, that level of mesquite smoke. So we were talking about mesquite smoke is just its own thing. Like, it's really hard to describe. Mesquite smoke tastes like mesquite smoke. I didn't really have, in Texas, we didn't really have mesquite smoked barbecue. What I had growing up in Texas was this restaurant that was right next to where my mom worked. It was called Skeeter's. So you can guess at what they're doing in there. They've got a mesquite powered grill. So when I would go to Skeeter's and get the hamburger loaded up with chili, right? Chili and cheese and all the fries and all that, like this whole, it's just a messy, like awesome thing. The taste of that meat, that mesquite grilled meat, is a flavor note that I got really loud and clear from the Dorado. And it makes me just want to go back again and again to it, because it gives me something that it's hard to compare with a whiskey that tickles exactly that core memory. You get those all over the place. It's why we start exploring. You get one whiskey that does that to you and you're like, oh, I need more of that. That feels really good. And every once in a while you find another whiskey that unlocks a different part of you. So this was one of those for me.
Thank you.
There was a question actually about Maryland, Baltimore Spirits Company. Was that?
No, 10th Ward Distilling Company in Frederick, Maryland. That was where I came from. So speaking of esoteric, lots of very esoteric things. We were mostly known for our absinthe, which still pretty proud of that absinthe.
All right. So now that we've all had a chance to sort of dead air our way through some tasting notes, I'm gonna go give it away now so that people can vicariously appreciate the tasting notes here. So the tasting notes we have: on the nose, you may get cookie dough and leather, followed by bright notes of sandalwood, orange zest, and bee balm blossom. On the palate, maple syrup leading into baking spice, punch across the mid palate with a bright, clean, but deceptively long finish. I'll give it to the deceptively long finish. When I first read that, I was like, I don't know what deceptively long means. But like, yeah, like
it sort of shows
I don't
up
know
again.
if this is yeah, I don't know if this is quite what you were going for, but it's like, yeah, it's long and then it kind of disappears and then, oh, it's back.
Yeah. And
like, that's a weird thing.
That's exactly what it was. Cause when we were blending it and we were getting close to the final blend, the thing I kept saying was like, I really like where this is at. You know, I like the front. I love the mid palate. I think it's nice and complex. It's bright. To me, it is a springy whiskey. It is a whiskey that can be enjoyed in warm weather. But I just don't feel like the finish is there. You know, I'll admit I'm a sucker for a nice long finish. Like I like when after I've taken my sip, stepped away, it's still coming back. And then, yeah, same thing. Like 30 seconds later, I was like, oh, wait, it's there. It's there again. Where did this come from?
You know what it is when it comes back? It's a lot heavier on the Calvados.
Mm-hmm.
Like specifically like the apple and sort of French oak notes are a lot more present late in the finish.
I would also like to say that one of the notes that I catch on the very tail end of the finish is like if you've ever taken like a fairly mild, definitely not Cuban. When I say Cuban, I definitely am not admitting that I've been a recipient of actual Cuban cigars. Nice before you smoke it.
The cat came back in, so I'm now demanding on Bartlemy's behalf that we see the cat.
He's being very demandy.
Human, you have not paid enough attention tonight.
Well, and that's just it. And you know, closed doors in the house. Like we can't abide by that.
Yep. You must confront the portal that is closed and conquer it. Yeah, okay. So not to dilly-dally forever long. We do have one more whiskey to get through, which is the Sentinel.
Yes.
So this is going to be a total 180 because we are going from super complex, blended, very much Scotch style, complicated aging. I dare I say near Solera system, or at least blender's dream is going on here, right? So we're going from this to a rye. And Phil is a big fan of rye, so yeah, we all have a bottle. Yeah, bottle club. So my first thought when I saw this in the box is, oh, I didn't know Del Bach had a rye. In fact, as a matter of fact, I completely missed that this was your product at ACSA. And then I'm like, okay, I didn't know they made rye. What's going on here? So I look on the back. And sure enough, in the appropriately sized font at the bottom where you'd expect, it says distilled and aged in Indiana.
Yep.
And I said, I bet dollars to donuts that's an MGP rye. And you probably can't say, maybe you can, but it definitely does taste like it to me. The 95.
So the Sentinel's kind of a new exploration for us. So obviously we're known for American single malt. You know, that's our bread and butter. That's what we've made our name on. We got the question a lot. Have you guys ever considered doing a bourbon? Have you ever considered doing a rye? The way our distillery is set up, we're not set up to make whiskeys like that. We are set up to do single malt, which is its own kind of beast. And because of that, because American single malt is very complex to make, because it's not high yielding, because it requires a lot of work, the price tag tends to reflect that. Again, our core line is $60 a bottle. And we had a lot of requests from bartenders and a lot of requests from people of like, can we create something that is maybe a little more accessible to be mixed into cocktails? And so we had this discussion and we're like, well, you know, we could always source something, but if we source something, we wanted to do it the right way. You know, we wanted to be transparent about it. We wanted to be clear in what we were doing, but then also do something that made it different. We didn't want to just buy somebody else's juice, slap a label on it and say, this is Grandpappy's recipe we found in a boot back in the barn that just happens to be the 95.5 that everyone else is using for their rye.
Thank you for
I
being
have
my
no
go-to
idea who
call-out.
you could be referencing there.
My go-to call out of BS family history recipes as a way of selling whiskey. Yes, thank you very much.
But yeah, so we were like, we're going to source something, and we tasted. I'm not exact. I tasted hundreds of rye samples. We tasted some stuff that was really good, but way out of our price range. We tasted some stuff that was really terrible and way out of our price range. And, we ended up coming back to the MGP. There's a reason it's one of the most utilized ryes out there. Is they know what they're doing. It's a solid rye. It mixes well. It's balanced. And again, we didn't want to just take it and not do anything unique with it. And so obviously the thought we had was, well, let's finish it in Dorado barrels. The easiest thing to do would be to take it, put it into our Mesquite-smoked barrels, let it finish and see what it can do. I apologize. He wants out again.
Yeah.
As one does.
Crack the door so he can come and go. But yeah, and so we tasted it and it was fine. This was a MGP rye that was finished in Mesquite smoked barrels, and I long maintain that I've never had a good idea. I've just stolen other people's. And so because we malt in house, we're producing a lot of mesquite charcoal, and kind of being inspired by the Tennessee method of filtering across sugar maple charcoal. We had the idea, what if we finish this whiskey, we take it and we filter that finished product across mesquite charcoal we produced during malting. And it just kind of popped. It created this very interesting, very complex note. It changed the mouthfeel. It changed the nose. And so that's kind of where Sentinel was born, was a way for us to create something unique, being transparent, owning what the process is, and then utilizing that as a way to kind of help us keep the lights on and, keep making the American single malt that we're known for.
So what I love about that story is that it's not just let's make another product. It's let's use something we already have and, be, if anything, more zero waste, right? Mm. Take that mesquite charcoal, take these used casks. For the most part, I believe you're aging in new casks.
We are. I'd say 98%. We do have some second and even a couple of third use that get mixed into each blend, but the bulk of it is in new oak.
So there's something about this. So first of all, it does clearly have that menthol and grass kind of thing that I associate with MGP 95.5 rye. So little doubt in my mind, if you hadn't confirmed it, I would still very firmly believe this is an MGP 95.5 rye. But that mesquite really does add something to it. And for me, so I already poured a bullet rye on the side, which is your classic example of a 95.5 MGP. And what I find in the Sentinel is that it's more grassy and less menthol, which is good for me because I think too much menthol in a whiskey is not my favorite thing. Mm-hmm. Actually, I actually think Bullet put me off of rye for a while because it is so menthol heavy, and I just wasn't into that. And so much other rye is also that same spec, right? Mm-hmm. So until you actually venture outside of the MGP 95.5 rye, you're stuck in that idea of what rye whiskey is. That's this sort of monoculture of rye. And there's so much cool stuff outside of that once you find it. And the thing that sort of convinced me that, I should give rye another look, there were two things actually. So Wild Turkey rye is a very low rye. Mm-hmm. It's also very good. And Wild Turkey is one of my favorite bourbon distilleries. And also the Balcones Texas 100% rye is just so different, so chocolatey. So like that convinced me that there's a range for rye. Mm-hmm. And so even though this one is staying pretty close to that MGP rye, it really is doing something different. And there's something about it that's reminding me of something that a rye, like a flavor profile I don't usually expect to get from a rye. And I think this is going to sound weird, but I think it's orgeat, like the almond puree that you put in tiki cocktails. That syrup of almond. Mm-hmm. And that's really cool. And there are hints of the mesquite flavor, not necessarily a smokiness to it.
And we wanted to strike that balance. we didn't trying to be thoughtful is something that we always try to be thoughtful and purposeful. And so we didn't want to just do things that were gimmicky, that again, the easy thing would be, all right, it's mesquited. Cool. We've checked it off. And we wanted to create something that still gave that sense of place and still kind of gave something that we call it a cousin. It's a cousin to the Whiskey Del Bach brand because, we are sourcing that original juice, but we're doing things that make it of Whiskey Del Bach and make it of the Southwest. And, it goes through to the packaging. You'll notice different bottle shape, different label design. We've got the horned owl as the logo on the front. One of the things we still haven't been able to quite get it dialed in yet. Eventually, though, the goal is also a percentage of the Sentinel rye sales will go to preservation here within the Sonoran Desert, of creating a way to, again, be stewards of the environment, to be sentinels of the desert. So, and I like that you poured some other like 95.5 because that was something we looked to as well. Was we had a handful of other 95.5 MGPs that we wanted to make sure we were different from. That again, like we don't need the same thing done again, right? And we call out very clearly on the back label that it is distilled and aged in Indiana, but it is blended, finished, and bottled by us in Tucson.
I went a slightly different. I also poured just a straight 95.5 MGP rye. The redemption that I realize is not really all that visible here because this is my go-to example of 95.5 rye. Got to be careful to remember which I can tell the difference. But then I also poured some of this.
Here's my my chance to call out once again. I like using watch glasses that I mark with a Sharpie. Not a Sharpie. Don't use a Sharpie. Dry erase marker. Dry erase marker writes well on glass.
I can actually. Not only are my Glencairns marked by brand, but I can tell by notes. This is the Redemption, which is that classic full-bodied, mentally a little bit spicy rye. This is the Dickel 95.5, which is MGP 95.5 that they've taken and blended themselves, charcoal filtered through the Lincoln County process with sugar maple charcoal. And that really sweetens it and makes it more, brings out the menthol that makes it really almost like minty gum, sort of. Whereas the mesquite charcoal completely changes the character. It still has a little bit of that menthol and the grass, but it's got the mesquite flavor. And I feel like, a combination of the additive process of finishing it in mesquited barrels and then doing the mesquite charcoal finish results in something that is very drinkable, still very heavy on flavor and character, and doesn't strip away as much as the sugar maple does. It doesn't add as much sweetness and sort of a saccharine nature.
Yeah, so this raises an interesting question for me. So your mesquite charcoal is the result of your malting process where you mesquite smoke the malt. You're not aiming to have it be pure charcoal, like pure carbon activated charcoal at the end,
right? Necessarily.
You don't take any extra step to make it more charcoal at the end, do you?
Not really. We just try to pull enough chunks out and then douse them before they just completely. And it's an interesting balance because we tried even just like, let's infuse mesquite. Let's take a stick of mesquite and toss it in, and that was awful. Like don't ever try to infuse mesquite wood by itself. It's astringent, it's terpene. It does not a good whiskey make. but yeah, we still wanted there to be some sort of additive. We wanted there to be an addition, a change within that flavor profile versus just taking a bunch of activated charcoal, running it through, and stripping out all those flavors that you've worked really hard for.
Right. So yeah, I get kind of what I was aiming at there, and I don't know if this is entirely true, but my assumption is the Lincoln County process is going for filtration through activated charcoal, which happens to be made from maple charcoal, which happens to be made from sugar maple wood. So yeah, go ahead.
I will say, and maybe it's just because I'm a weird woodworking nerd, I've handled sugar maple. It has a stickiness to it. I would assume that when they make this sugar maple charcoal, they aren't really getting anything as neutral as you would think. What they're ending up with is essentially heavily caramelized maple sugars and charcoal. So the charcoal is glomming onto things, and the alcohol is dissolving that heavily caramelized maple sugars and pulling it through, which is why it's so sweet. Which is one of the things that people complain about Dickel, is that it is very sweet. I could be wrong, but that's my understanding.
Yeah. So here a bunch of single malt nerds theorize about maple charcoal and Tennessee whiskey. Yeah, this is like surprisingly good, right? I mean, I knew that Phil would be into it. I don't drink much rye, so I'm always like, I come in with an open mind, right? But I don't generally expect to find favorite things in rye and bourbon anymore, right? Especially if we're not talking about finished, right? Finished rye and finished bourbon. I usually like those. I think that it adds variety, it adds complexity. But usually when you're talking about something which is just a straight, is this a straight rye? Yes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, when you're talking about a straight rye, no finish, like how much variation could there be? But that the mesquite charcoal is a stroke of genius.
It again, and it's what elevated it. Like that was, I will forever say that, the finish was good. Like we finished it and was like, no, this is nice, but you can still just really tell that this is your standard 95.5. And yeah, just, I will always steal other people's good ideas.
All right. I know that it's getting late, but we had a good question earlier that I kind of skipped over, and maybe that wasn't the best move because it was topically appropriate. So Freedom Maltz asked, do you support the idea of creating regions in American single malt as with Scotch?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. I would love to see it happen naturally, like from an organic standpoint. I'm always kind of torn on if you're assigning these specific labels, these specific, okay, this is, Isla, this is Campbelltown, this is Southwest, this is Sunbelt, whatever you may call it, are you then expecting those whiskeys to conform to that identity? I love the idea because I do think you can track similarities. I think, you can look at these regions and see similar products coming out, even though they are distinctly different. I don't know. I guess there's just a part of me that just gets a little nervous if you assign too many labels, are you working to stifle that creativity, that individuality? Again, like a good example of like if you're looking at southwestern mesquited American single malts, the way we do it is very different than the way Santa Fe Spirit does it. And if you assign that label, then are you expecting like one of us to then meet in the middle or both to meet in the middle and change that production process? One of the things that I love about the proposed, and God, I hope one of these days approved TTB designations of American single malt is it is so wide. It does allow for this wide berth of innovation and of creativity. And so that's a very wishy-washy answer, I understand, but like I love the idea of it coming organically, and you can kind of start doing those groupings. I just worry that if you have something set so specifically, that you run that risk of pigeonholing, and I would hate to see that.
One of the things that I've pointed out when this has come up before is that in Virginia, you have Copper Fox, who uses all their, or a bulk of their malt is smoked with hardwood smoke. And then you have the Virginia Distillery Company. What defines the regional style? Because they are extremely different. You could put them side by side and have someone guess where they are from, and they wouldn't guess roughly the same region. And I say roughly the same region because actually I'm going to say they're from the same region of Virginia, which is the Piedmont region, rolling hills. And that is a thread that carries through all of the United States, is that there are so many distilleries that are producing spirit in the same region as other distilleries that are getting wildly different results. And even with 100% malted barley, you know, whether it's smoke source, the style of aging, style of yeast that they're using, or even their fermentation style, I'm not sure that it's as easily categorically sortable as Scotch is because of the way commerce has developed in the US. If we were talking about this roughly 150 years ago, it would be a different story, because you would have regional access to various goods that would change the way malt is treated in various regions, but that just isn't the case.
Yeah, I have many conflicting thoughts on this. When I started working on the book, I initially wanted to organize distilleries by region. And I never really, like, at first blush, you go, that's a great idea. We can talk about the Pacific Northwest. We can talk about California. We can talk about the high desert. We can talk about Texas, the Midwest, the Northeast, the East. But then when you actually look at the character of the distilleries and the malts that are coming out of all of those regions, there's maybe some commonalities across 60% of the representatives of each of those regions. Do we just ignore the other 40%? Or, you know, just as easily, because craft single malt in the United States is from the early 90s, right? McCarthy's is the oldest one, and it's been 3 decades at the most for any of these distilleries, which means that American single malt, like myself, I was born in 1990. Hi. Right. American single malt, like myself, grew up with the internet, right? Not after the internet, not where it was a foregone conclusion that you go on the internet to figure out the answers to all of your questions and you get information from anywhere in the world, but more in like, we're going to figure it out ourselves. But then when we have questions, we're going to go to the internet and figure out what we want. We can order our equipment from anywhere. We have Amazon or the equivalent for distilling equipment. Like, you can make whatever malt you want to make, and you're only limited by your imagination and to some degree the climate in which you're aging, but you can also climate control. So you really can make whatever you want to make to a large degree. Like, you're not going to get the, you know, the naturally diurnal shifting, you know, Texas Central Plains aging style in the Pacific Northwest unless you intentionally climate control your warehouse day and night. So that would be impractical, but like, you could approximate that if that's what you really wanted to do. I'm not saying it would make sense, but like, just as easily, like, let's just take climate control. Like, if you climate control anywhere, you can make any whiskey you want essentially anywhere. There's going to be differences that are just down to distillery style, right? The equipment interacting with the choice of barrels, interacting with the choice of finishes, the cut points. Like, just, it feels like you could draw the lines regionally, but you could just as well not draw those lines.
Right.
So should we? And the problem would be, if you grew to expect a certain thing from the Pacific Northwest, I could already point to 3 of my favorite distilleries in the region that are nothing like each other: McCarthy's, Westland, and Copperworks. And Westward, a 4th data point that is nothing like any of the others, right? They have almost nothing in common except a philosophy. The whiskey is very, very different. So what is Pacific Northwest whiskey from a flavor? I mean, as far as consumers concerned. So I won't name names on this. I think that's important. But I heard from someone in the industry, a surprising person, that they felt, and don't read too much into this, I'm probably misquoting or misrepresenting this in some way, but American single malt doesn't feel like a category in scare quotes. Because if you see the label American single malt on something like Westland, or something like Westward, something like Del Bach, something like Virginia Distilling Company, and you go to another arbitrary brand that also says American single malt, you have no idea what to expect. So from a consumer perspective, what is the category? And it gets even weirder when you start drilling down into regions where those same problems exist, but the extra specificity makes you expect something.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, and I think, that's an interesting point. But to me, it's one of the reasons that I've, again, fallen in love with the category is, it's you don't know. And to me, that's kind of the beautiful thing. And, that's not to throw shade in like on bourbon or rye or, wheat whiskeys, things like that. But you tend to know what you're going to get. You're going to have those variations, but for the most part, you know what you're going to get with a bourbon. You know what you're going to get with a rye. And to me, that's the beautiful thing about American single malt is, it's malted barley, but man, there are so many other things you could do to that. And, it's such a beautiful blank canvas to paint on that, I can see that point. I can see the point of, is it too ephemeral? Is it too varied so that as a consumer, I'm going to get overwhelmed and go, well, if I don't know what to expect, why am I going to just start throwing darts at the wall and hope I find one I like? But I don't know. I think to me, that's the appeal. That's the thing that makes it such a interesting category. And I think what has drawn a lot of people to it. And, obviously I can't speak for every consumer, but that idea of that variation as a consumer excites me and makes me very interested in what's going on within the category.
Yep. I definitely take more of that perspective personally. The thing that inspires my imagination about American single malt, why I want to try so many different ones of them and talk to the people who make them to understand how they made those choices and what they're doing that's unique. The category is defined by its indefinability, right? In a sense. I mean, 100% malted barley is a very small requirement, and that's essentially the only requirement on the category. Any type of cask you want, any type of still you want. Some limits on, distillation and barrel entry proof, but like from any technical perspective that someone really wants to push, American single malt can be anything you want. That's what's awesome about it to me. Yeah, and on that note of regionality, right? Like that being the main question. At this point in my head, I feel I don't want to advocate for there being regions. I want to embrace the category as a whole for its beautiful diversity.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think it's interesting, it's blasphemous if you are a Scotch producer or an Irish whiskey producer to maybe intimate that the way the standards are set, maybe they're not perfect. But, I personally know some people within the industry in both countries that there is kind of maybe that growing frustration of it's stifling innovation, and having those purposely broad definitions can maybe do things to create things that are more interesting. And yeah, I like the idea of things happening organically. oh, this is a style. This is a, category. I think as humans, we like to naturally try to categorize things. But yeah, I think I'm with you. Just like that idea of creating something that is like hard and fast, or a specific definition of regions. Yeah.
Yeah. A couple of good questions here as follow-ups. Carrie Daniels asks, is there at least a commonality of angel share percentage? Because Santa Fe may be the same as Del Box.
That's a good question. I know I've talked to some other distillers like within Texas, and I know we do share similar loss rates. And I could be wrong. I'm pretty sure Santa Fe also adjusts for temperature and humidity. So they're trying to work to create that more classic, like Scottish style. So utilizing things like that is going to have an impact on your angel share. Because I will tell you one thing, we've had consultants who've come in and looked at Whiskey Del Bach, and to a T, every single one of them has said, you guys have to have humidity control because your angel share is terrible. And we're like, yeah, but that's part of the process. Like, no, I would never, I hate it. The business side of me cringes every time I harvest and I crunch the numbers on angel share, but that's what makes Del Bach Del Bach. And so I know obviously humidity is a big thing. Temperature is a big thing. I mean, speaking of Ryan at Boulder, like we've had that conversation, they're very dry where they're at, and, they've got aggressive angel share as well. And so can you look at those as guidelines? I think, extra data points are good, but utilizing those to, I think, specifically define, it's tough because, like you said, you can adjust for things. You can temperature control, you can humidity control, you can change your barrel entry proof. That's going to change what your angel share is.
From the Bourbon Van on Instagram, we have love tasting an ASMW for the first time from a new distillery. It's like blasting a piñata at a 4th grade birthday party, except for adults with adventurous palates. It's a very well put.
I like that.
I love that.
John Hughes asks, if you do the same thing with Scotch single malt, what do you expect there? Regions bring differences, and the regions for ASM are much more diverse because of landmass, which is actually a really good point. I'll take the devil's advocate on that. So Speyside is a category with a ton of distilleries in it. Some of them are samey, a lot of them are not. I know people that will try. I'm trying to remember an example, but like this is probably not fair because you look at like a closed distillery, like I can't remember the name of it right now, but there's
Brora or Clean Leash. Clean Leash reopened shortly after they closed, but Brora is the classic closed Speyside example.
Yeah,
with a very waxy.
Yeah, so that's sort of like you could look in Speyside and you can find examples of stuff that's kind of like Campbelltown, or that's kind of like a lightly peated Isla in a way, or something else entirely. And if you're looking at Macallan, technically a Speyside, they market themselves as a Highland, right? And you look at that as a very clean, like, this is the quintessential Speyside. You should expect all Speysides to be like this, but and their marketing would have you believe, but not as good, right? And then you have sort of the cluster of like your Glenfiddich, Tom and Toole, sure, yeah. You got your Glenfiddich, your Glenlivet. Those are different, but not so different, right? They share a DNA, right? But there's a lot of examples where it doesn't, and I don't think that's a bad thing, right? I wouldn't be disappointed when I bought a Speyside whiskey that surprised me. I would think that's a good thing, but that's me, right? I'm a person who loves American single malt for all of its beautiful diversity. So you're asking the wrong person, right?
I will say that the idea that distilleries within a region in Scotland share commonality in flavor profile is easily falsifiable, because you have things like Old Pulteney, which is a Highland distillery. It's in Wick, I think. Yes, Wick in Scotland. For a while, it was the northernmost mainland's Highland Scotch whiskey distillery. It is rich and salty and almost like a really earthy, almost peaty whiskey. In the same region, you have, technically speaking, Blair Athol, which is polar opposite. It's light, it's clean, vegetal, and bright fruits. They're the same region, yet they almost couldn't be farther apart. And then you've got Ardmore, which is a peated Highland malt. I mean, it's one of those. The regions in Scotland make less sense the more you know about them. Geographically, they make sense, but they kind of don't in terms of the spirit production.
And I predict that with time, I mean, we're seeing new distilleries open in Scotland, which I think when you're getting into Scotch and you look at this country that has such an old tradition of making whiskey, and you say, oh, why would they need to open any new distilleries, right? But then you find out, yeah, actually they are opening new distilleries and they're going to have saleable liquid within a few years. I predict that we're actually going to see a shift gradually from this idea that the regions are very tightly defined to something that is a lot more nebulous as people build the distilleries to make the liquid they want to make. And they just happen to be in Speyside or Lowlands or Campbelltown. We're going to find out, I think Witchburn is the name.
Yes.
Who we have, Witchburn is run by the friend of a friend, Raymond from the Whiskey Lodge. Shout out to you for that connection. So we're going to find out maybe, what a new Campbelltown distillery that isn't run by the same people that run Springbank, right? Like what that's going to be like, because right now Campbelltown is Springbank and another distillery that's basically Springbank and Glen Scotia.
and Glen Scotia couldn't be more different than Longrow, Kilkerran, and Springbank.
Yeah,
I mean, and
not to mention,
it's sort of the same as with the US, where you could easily in a day drive to Livingston, Virginia, have a tour of Virginia Distillery Company, eat a hearty lunch, sit for a couple hours, let it get out of your system, and then drive to Sperryville or Williamsburg, Virginia, and visit Copper Fox.
I liked your casual drink responsibility disclaimer.
Always.
Yeah. It's good to remember to bring those things into this conversation. Okay. So I know that we've eaten up quite a lot of time with this debate. There's a couple more questions, real rapid fire, that I want to ask. So first of all, there's guitars on the wall behind you. I have to ask. So I see a guitar and I see a bass. Which do you prefer?
Bass. So bass is what I learned on. Bass is what I play. I've got a PV, and then just off, I've got a BC Rich Warlock.
Nice.
Right there. Yeah, and then I think that's a Silvertone guitar that I got in high school. But yeah.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yep. I actually have wall mounts for my guitars and I haven't decided where to put them yet. But like I said, I'm reorganizing this room as part of this whole brand transformation. So maybe the guitars will end up in shot, maybe not. Depends on how much whiskey shelving I put behind me.
It's a great look. People are like, how often do you play, or do you play? I'm like, by the bassist definition.
Yeah. Practice enough to be a bassist.
Yeah, exactly. Man, I can read tabulatures till the cows come home.
Yeah, I play viola in orchestra, and I've been doing that for. I was actually recently reminded. It's been more than 2 decades. I've been playing viola for 23 years, and I've been playing bass for, whenever I picked up, probably 8 years ago. Whenever I picked up bass, so those are sort of my 2 main instruments that I play with groups.
Ooh. Yeah, I used to be a
Phil has a collection of very interesting brass instruments.
I love it. That's outstanding.
Okay, next quick question. You have small format barrels, which means I'm interested in whether you retire them into the service of barrel rested coffee.
We do, and in fact, I think I was just watching your interview with Ryan and you asked that question, I was like, oh, I'm prepared to answer this. Yes, we do have 15s and we do regularly partner with coffee makers. So
awesome. So if I were theoretically going to ask you to source a barrel for a local coffee roaster to me, would that be something that I could work out?
Oh yeah, 100%. I'd love that.
I have a tangentially related question. What is the dry weight of a 15-gallon barrel? Because I know off the top of my head what the dry weight of a 30-gallon barrel is. And I'm just curious for data points.
It's like 30 pounds.
Okay.
You could toss it around.
For reference, dry weight on a 30-gallon barrel is roughly 67 pounds. Yeah, that
Don't leave me hanging. What's the 53-gallon barrel?
53-gallon barrel is, and it varies depending on the make and the wood used,
Of course.
roughly 125 to 140 pounds. And those are dry weights. Adding
so
liquid,
if you were deadlifting that'd be fine. But if you're trying to hold it out like this, you're probably no go.
Yeah.
I can tell you our barrels is 115 pounds worth of new make. So that's 15 gallons at 110 proof is 115 gallons. So all told, our barrels full are around 150.
That's remarkably like manageable. Like I after moving around the empty 30-gallon barrel that I have, the idea of having to move around a full one makes me think a lot more about logistics.
Roll.
Yeah. I can't just throw a like 300-pound barrel onto my shoulder, unfortunately.
All right, so one last rapid fire question, our standard question. When you're not drinking your own product, what are you drinking?
Cheap beer.
All right.
Honestly, it's interesting. I actually drink so much more beer since I became a distiller than I ever did before. It's a bad habit. You get into the habit of analyzing. And sometimes you just kind of want to sit and enjoy a drink. So I will admit an affection for PBR and an affection for Coors Banquet. If it's coming to other spirits, my go-to whiskey is actually the Balvenie 14, the Caribbean cask. Just
nice.
Beautifully done, always accessible. And then my wife and I drink a lot of gin. Lots of complexity. We do like that kind of herbalness. I'm a big fan of like big juniper bombs. So, but yeah, our go-to is still our own stuff, which we were having this conversation. I'm like, I feel like that's kind of like gauche, right? Like I shouldn't be like, well, what do you drink? Well, my own stuff. But it really is like, it is the stuff that we go to.
Related, on Instagram, Emmer, I can't read that. Emmer Salden asks, is it like how when you work at a restaurant, you don't want to eat there anymore?
I've been really, really happy. It hasn't been, because it can be. It's been like that in the past of like, I'm tasting it every day. I'm focused on it. I'm analyzing it. I'm trying to make sure it's to spec. And to me, again, I think it's kind of a testament to at least the accessibility of our stuff that I'm still happy to go home and pour a glass. That like I can still sit and enjoy it and not be like, oh man, we've got way too much fusel oil in here. We let this sit too long, really mess those cuts up. So, but again,
that reminded me
the cheap beer because, like, man, sometimes I just like to not have to think.
I apologize to bring it back to geeky talk about whiskey, but there was a question I didn't ask earlier that I should have. So you mentioned the Hearts of the Hearts cut, which, as Isla fans will know, one of the things that makes Ardbeg so smoky in perceived flavor is that they do. That's where I thought Bartolome was going with that. We'll get to that. So they dip deep into the tails in order to get more of the fusel oils and more of that smokiness. And you're not doing that. But as Isla fans will also know, the longer you let smoky whiskey sit in a barrel, the less smoky it becomes. So Del Bach is balancing that out by having short barrel aging times. Do you find that you've lost anything you wish you could have in the deeper part of the hearts?
I wish we had a little more body to the smoke sometimes. That is probably my one like wish with how we produce is, yeah, the deeper you get into tails, the more pronounced that smoke becomes. And speaking of Bartle May and like McCarthy's, one of the things I love about McCarthy's is there's like a honey baked ham note to it. It's savory, it's salty, it's sweet, and I love that about that. And I wish we could push those borders a little bit more. But I can also tell you, like having tasted that new make, going into those small format barrels, what comes out is really off balance. It comes across as kind of cloying. And so in the future, I would love for us to play around with some 53s. So we could do that a little bit more, like just really every once in a while, pity my amazing production staff that occasionally I'll get a hair up my ass and be like, we're cutting way deep into tails today. I just want to see what it's going to do. They're like, dude, you've done this. It never turns out right. Like, yeah, but I think it'll turn out really well this time. I think it's striking that balance. It's standing there at that still and going, yep. Okay, no, cut. But yeah, I'd like to have, I think, just a little bit more of that meatiness, a little bit more of that kind of savory note sometimes.
All right, quick question. What barrel proof are you going in at?
We go in at 110, so 55% ABV. That was actually one of the changes that management let me do, which I was really excited about. We had been going in at 120 pretty much since the beginning, traditional Scottish style. One of the things that I wanted to take advantage of is, especially when you're going into new oak, and especially when you're going to new oak that has a toast on it, as you lower that proof, you're kind of maximizing those water-soluble chemicals you're getting out of that wood. And those are those wood sugars, those are the lignans. So you're getting a lot of coconut, you're getting a lot of butterscotch, you're getting a lot of those kind of candied notes. And so I think going into that lower proof has really helped kind of bolster that body and cut a little bit down on some of the tannic bite that we used to have in the past. So we go in at 110. Depending on when we pull, we're coming out anywhere between 112 up to 115.
Nice. All right. We're going to get into Bartolomeo's comment because I don't know if this is what she meant, but she says a 53-gallon barrel is a standard Dwight. And at first I was like, is that a typo for weight? But I'm also imagining that Rainn Wilson weighs the dry weight of a 53-gallon barrel. Which is plausible.
I would believe that.
So she says they call it a standard Dwight weight or 1 unit of Dwight, and this makes me believe that is actually what she means. Okay, I think John did some math. This is hashtag he did the math. If the final fill of the barrel is around 150 pounds, the dry barrel weight is between 40 and 50 pounds based on the math of 110 proof alcohol going into the barrel, I think is what he's saying. It's a 15-gallon barrel, but as we previously established, it was 30-ish pounds.
Yeah, so 115 pounds of new make going in. So if we do 150 minus 1, that's around 35.
I mean, but also give or take 5 pounds is sort of, I hate to say it, but a lot of the cooperages, leaving, a little bit thin or a little bit thick in various places, you're going to get variation in barrel weight. Also, wood density.
I think I see. I'm checking your math now, John. I think I see where you made your mistake. So, yes, ethanol is 0.79 the density of water, but alcohol water mixtures do not have what you would think of as a predictable density. Go look up an alcoholometric table. Go look up the density of ethanol water mixtures. There's a density peak in there somewhere. It's not a linear graph. It's kind of a bell curve.
And it's weird.
It's a little surprising.
It's so weird.
The best thing to do is to look it up.
I had to find a calculator to get proofing for this. To figure out how to work out how much water to new make spirit to mix to get the proof I wanted. And I still got it wrong.
It's pounds here, it's pounds there. It's the fact that the actual volume of the barrel is not exact. I mean, I have a 2-liter barrel back here that routinely takes 2.25 liters, right? It's not magic, it's just that it's not spec, right?
Yeah. You want to talk about off? Oh, I have a great story. I did the math. I used the calculator to figure out how much new make I needed. I bought a 1-gallon barrel. This barrel took 4.5 liters of spirit.
Yeah, that's a margin of error a little bit.
Yeah.
3 point what? How much liters?
It's like 3.791, I think.
3.8 liters in a gallon ish.
Yeah. And
yeah, you got a little extra.
Yeah. The math was a disaster. And I missed my proof point, which is why I had so much. I missed my proof point by 2. I was wanting to go in at 114. I went in at 112.6.
Yeah. Well, it's tough to do that math. And there's a reason that distillers get paid the big bucks, right? Doing the alcoholometric tables.
And why we also have expensive equipment.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I don't see any additional questions. So one more quick fun question before we cut. Are you in any way interested in joining the Rangers Respite Distillers and Dragons campaign?
I am so interested. I struggle to find time. That's the issue I always run into.
Yeah.
I'm such a huge nerd, and my son's a DM, and he's always like, you need to be doing this, and I just have to find the time.
Yeah, no, I know my schedule of everything I'm doing, I'm already squeezing in. So,
but I will add it to my as I can find things.
The entire audience is invited to this.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you can roll dice and you want to play with distillers, we'll find a way to make guests happen.
Yeah.
I think honestly, the problem we're going to have is that there's actually too many people interested for like a sustainable amount of DMing, right? Like we're already in the realm where we're going to have to co-DM in order to make this work. Just the level of work. Bartolome asks, pancakes or waffles? Very good question. Very important. It says something about you. Just remember that.
Waffles. They've got little pockets. They can hold extra syrup. Plus, chicken and waffles, especially like Nashville hot chicken and waffles. That's my go-to brunch. So, like a good pancake.
Also, State Farm is there. What?
Yeah, exactly.
Not an ad. That was a joke.
No. I enjoy a good pancake. Waffles are where I'm going to go.
All right. So, what's your go-to waffle topping, and why is it Delbach Distiller's Cut?
I mean, so you joke, but a little bit of like Frank's Buffalo hot sauce, some 100% maple syrup, and just a little hit of the Dorado. Whisk that together, cross the top of that spicy chicken. So good. A little bit sweet, a little bit savory. Get that nice little heat from the booze.
Mm-hmm. That
God,
sounds awesome. Well, I'm glad we brought this up. Absolutely. I think I'm gonna call it the end of questions, because otherwise we're gonna end up in the French toast rabbit hole that we hit last week. If that sounds fun to you, go watch us talk about French toast for an hour last week. But we're going to cut that off before it happens again, because it's 8 o'clock on the West Coast and it's time for us to go do our evening things. So thanks everyone for joining. Thank you for joining for our last episode of the podcast branded the Demi Tastes Podcast. Next week, it will be Single Malt Frontier. We're going to have a new intro, hopefully. We're going to have all new fun things. It's going to be the same content, the interviews with the experts that you love to hear from. So we're looking forward to having a branding that's more cohesive with what we're doing. And yes, John, thank you for reminding me. This is on YouTube, so I am contractually obligated to remind you all to like, subscribe, and ring that bell, and all the other things that are good for the algorithm. Did you know if you save my videos for watch later, but you don't let them play, YouTube doesn't think that they're any good? So you should actually open up the video and let it play for a little bit, and then save it for watch later. That's the trick.
Algorithms.
Copy the link, hit the share button, not just your URL bar. Hit the share button, copy the link, send it to your friends, or don't. The fact that you copied the link sends a signal to the algorithm. So if you want to help us grow, do those things that help with social media engagement. Also, I just made a new Instagram account for Single Malt Frontier that is going to be specifically podcast content, which will open up my Demi Tastes Instagram channel to be more of the everyday stuff that interests me. The drams, the coffee, the shenanigans, and not necessarily all just clips from this show. So hopefully that helps focus the content a little bit better, and hopefully it isn't too much for me to manage. Let me know what you guys think. Looking forward to moving into the new era of treating this thing like a professional podcast. So cheers all, and until next time. Well, let's find a whiskey that I still have some in the glass.
I've got the Distiller's cut.
You know, we glossed over this,
some of
but this cheers is relevant to Mark. Mark joined Delbach and made some changes. In the interest of time, let's not get into that. There was some references to that earlier. You can go look for those Easter eggs. Speaking of Easter eggs, look at the thumbnail and the promotional material that we did, and you might find something fun. So, to finding change, to good change for the better. Cheers. And until next time, we'll see you in the lodge. Good night, everybody.
Good night.